So, good morning to all of you. Can you hear me? Good morning to all of you. Welcome to the 22nd to this June board meeting of the IESBA. I'm very pleased to have you all here, and most of you in person, which is not only a good sign that things are improving at least a little bit, and although we are not yet out of the woods, but it's also important because of the best way to hold these meetings. I'd like also to greet those who are attending virtually and thank them for their effort and for their commitment, because we know that for most of you, these meetings will be held in hours which are not that much appropriate for you. So thank you very much for your commitment, and thank you for being with us and participating in this board meeting. So I'm very pleased to welcome you to our second board meeting of this year, which is also my second board meeting and the second board meeting for some of the board members. I hope that you have all been keeping safe and well. We know that there are a lot of COVID cases again, but hopefully all of you are okay, have been okay, and I hope that all of us will get out and finish this meeting still in good health. It is very good to see many of you again in person, and some of you for the first time, especially those that I have met on the screen in the March board member and board meeting, and also in the November and December board meeting. Some of you, it's very good to have you here for the first time. It's a different and a new situation. So, COVID, as I was saying, is still a challenge around the world, but despite this challenge, most of the world continues to care, despite the challenge and the improvements, much of the world continues to careful transition to a post-pandemic world in which we become accustomed to coexisting with the virus, which is exactly what we are trying to do. And this is to be our new normal. I'd like to welcome a few people to this board meeting. In particular, the new starting with our official observers: Gary Hansen, IESBA CAG chair, Junpei Kato from the Japan FSA, and Robert Buckingham, PIOB observer. Welcome, Robert. I think it's your first time, or at least since I'm here representing the PIOB at the board, so very welcome to our meeting. And a special welcome to some who are new and are joining us now. Bruno Tesnier, new technical advisor to Christelle Martin, and I'm happy to inform that you have already been informed by an email, but that Christelle Martin is now going to be to have the support of Bruno Tesnier. Welcome. And Kristen Widdle, technical advisor to China, who is also new. Many of you will know Kristen. She's not new for all of you, as she was the TA to Ian McPhee, the former board member, who completed his term on the board last December. I'd also to welcome Richard Fleck, who will attend the Wednesday technology session and for one of the items of the executive session agenda. Denise Canavan, former IESBA technical advisor and member of the engagement team group audits task force, who will attend the Wednesday engagement team group audits session. And the IEESB staff, Natalie Konaridis and Kalina Shukarova, who will attend the PI rollout session on Monday for the reasons that you may already have understood, because of the relationship of the work between the two members, the two boards. I take this opportunity to extend a very warm welcome to the international observers who have registered to follow this week's discussion on the IESBA YouTube channel. I will not well, I will not send an individual welcome and thank, but we have a number of interested people and parties attending and observing this meeting. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for your interest and for joining us at this meeting. So, on the agenda ahead of us, as I had already told you or mentioned to you, and you had already seen, we have a very exciting and important agenda ahead of us from here to Wednesday. We have several important projects and initiatives on the agenda. We are right now, following these initial remarks, we are kicking off with a presentation from our Sustainability Working Group, where, among other matters, we will discuss the working group proposed terms of reference and the proposed Sustainability Stakeholder Questionnaire. Then we will hear from Andy on the PI rollout and the PI rollout working group's recent activities, including its coordination with IESBA. And lastly, on today's agenda, we have an update from the director of IFAC's International Panel on Accountancy Education on its priorities and coordination activities with IESBA. Moving to Tuesday, Jens will present the feedback received from the global roundtables on our tax planning project and the task force's preliminary views. And we will then hear from Vanya, where is Vanya, on the EIOC's recent activities, followed by an update on the IESBA coordination. On the last day of the meeting, Brian will report back on the technology working group's fact-finding activities to date, and we will close with Caroline, who is unfortunately not here with us because of other overlapping and important commitments, but who will attend the meeting partially with us. I was saying that we will close with Caroline's presenting an overview of initial significant matters raised in the comment letters to our engagement team group audit exposure draft. Let me take this opportunity to thank the task force and working group chairs, all of you, for leading these sessions and for, of course, having led the work that allowed these sessions to take place today. And the task force's working groups and staff for their very hard work in preparing the agenda remarks. Of course, this thank is extensive in a very special way to the IESBA staff, directors, and principals, managers, supporting staff, etc., who have been working very hard to make this all possible, providing their support to the task forces and to the task forces chairs, and participating in very important strategic discussions that I hope will have some echo today in our discussions. A special thank you to all those participants who have already provided comments in advance of the meeting on the agenda material, and to those, again, joining us via Zoom as these unsocial hours in your time zones. So from here, I'd like to say a few words about our recent outreach and related activities. I had the opportunity to send you a too long email, but I was I didn't have the notion of how long it was, only when I finished that. And then I decided not to delete anything and to leave it like as it was. But as I don't know if you had time to read it, I'd say some words about our recent outreach activities. It's impressive, the work, not only me, but the staff always with me, and all the board members and some technical advisors who have been involved in these outreach activities. The schedule of the outreach activities is in agenda item 1B, and you would have seen it live at IESBA. Is being extremely dynamic. I'd say hectic, and besides the release of a number of documents since March, including our PI rollout pronouncement, the strategy survey, which is a strategic in nature document and piece for IESBA, and benchmarking report. We have been very busy engaging in outreach with many and different stakeholders. It's not in, they are not many in, not only in number, but in the backgrounds and the sectors that they represent. So the record of our outreach activities speaks for itself in these last 3 months since the last board meeting, and I will not say more at this point, but I will take the opportunity during the executive session on Wednesday to report back on some of the more recent outreach I have undertaken, which were already undertaken after the report was done, and so it's not reflected there. I would also encourage all board members and TAs to be ambassadors of IESBA in your respective jurisdictions and within your networks and circles. This is important. This is also one of the reasons why it is so important to have geographical diversity at the board. It's not the only one, but it's one of them. It's because each one of you can serve as an ambassador in your jurisdictions. As I have said in many of my presentations to stakeholders over the past months, ethics is an essential condition to sustainable businesses and economies because it produces trust. And this is the business we are in. It's helping, contributing to create, reinforce, rebuild trust in business and in business in general. While the public recognition of the role of ethics has grown significantly, and I think that we are all aware of that, of how much it has grown in the recent years, it is important that even more of our stakeholders hear the message and understand the fundamental part of our code plays in creating trust in the work of professional accountants. So it's important that we are all together working for this purpose, and I thank you, the board. I thank all the board members and all those who participate or will participate in outreach activities for their contribution to this goal. If you have participated in any outreach activities that are not recorded, please share it as appropriate and let us know so that you can record it as well. So on the planning committee met via video conference in May, and among other matters, the planning committee had a debrief of the UK outreach and discussed plans for upcoming outreach upcoming but already undertaken outreach, including in the US. The planning committee received an update on the sustainability working group's activities and discussed the planning for June 22 board meeting, while also having received an update on the preparation of the 2023 IESBA budget, which is also important. And it's important to involve the planning committee in this discussion. The IESBA NSS National Standard Setters meeting was held virtually on May 10 and was attended by 15 different jurisdictions. We discussed the sustainability initiative and provided a final update on the benchmarking initiative. I take the opportunity to stress that we had in this session, alongside Mark Babington, of course, we had Sasha Saddam from the sustainability director of the UK FSA, together with us, discussing with Mark Babington in a public discussion. But we also had a session with the NSS with Ugo Bassi from the European Commission, Sue Lloyd from the International Sustainable Standards Board, and Paul Munter from the SEC. So the representatives of the main organizations which are issuing standards or rules on sustainability reporting. I'm also happy to inform the board that IFAC has received funding from the World Bank to translate the 2022 edition of the IESBA handbook into Spanish. Once we have released this the latest edition this summer. It's important. Spanish, as you know, is one of the most the spoken languages, and it's important to reach out to make this available in a more friendly way to these countries and people. Some of you have received calendar invitations for tomorrow's photo shoot. This is scheduled for the few remaining board members who were not able to take part in the December and March photo shoots. So please make yourself available. It's important to have updated photos of everybody for the appropriate purposes. On the staff, and this is a very important topic, the staff is what allows us to exist and work, who support us all. The IESBA principal recruitment process is nearing completion with shortlisted candidates. I also mentioned that in my email, having completed final interviews last week. We will wrap up the process over the coming days, and I'm hopeful that we will be able to introduce the new member of staff at the September board meeting. Let me also give a special welcome to Shizuka Kaneda. I don't know if she's here. I didn't have the opportunity to meet her. Hello, welcome. Shizuka Kaneda is a secondee from the JICPA. And she started officially on May 23. She has already been assigned to support the engagement team group audit task force alongside with Sylvia Schramko. We also have a new summer intern, Drake Gossi, who started last week. He will assist the team working on various projects. So also at this level, we have some changes and some developments, and we hope that on the near future, we will keep on having other developments in the same direction so that the staff can sleep, first thing, and secondly, support us appropriately. So on some administrative matters, I would like to invite Ken to highlight any other administrative matters that Ken may have. Ken, please.
Thank you, Gabriela. Just a couple of reminders to the board. First of all, the microphones, if you would like to speak, please do speak into the microphones, or otherwise bring the microphones closer to you so that those who are joining us virtually will be able to hear us as clear as possible. Secondly, the COVID testing, just a reminder in case you did not receive the memo from ASTU, the expectation is that board participants who are attending the meeting in person would test every other day. Presumably everybody has done their testing today or last night. If I could ask you also to test on Wednesday morning or before you come to the board meeting on Wednesday, that would be good. And at least that's going to give at least a degree of reassurance to everybody that we are all clear. And finally, for lunch, I think in keeping with the theme of sustainability today, it's going to be a vegetarian lunch. So for those of you meat eaters, if you would please be open to this vegetarian lunch, I think that'd be good, and certainly very supportive of our efforts on the sustainability front. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Just one additional welcome. I'm sorry for having missed it. Nigel James from IOSCO, who is attending in person, observing the meeting. Thank you very much for your presence. It's important to have all these people here. And with this, I'm coming to the end of these initial remarks. The minutes of the draft minutes of the March IESBA public session have been distributed to the board for review. If you have any comments, please email them to ASTU until noon tomorrow, so that they can be accommodated and incorporated in the final version. And the board will be asked to approve the minutes on Wednesday morning. After these housekeeping issues, let me skip and move to the next item in the agenda, unless any of you have any remark, any question, or any comment to these initial remarks. But if not, and right before giving the floor to Mark Babington, who will present the working group work, update us on the activities and present the documents, the mandate that is being and the questionnaire that is being submitted for discussion. Let me tell you 2 or 3 words about this work stream. As you know, it's a new work stream. We approved the constitution, forming the new working group on March. Their mandate is still to be approved, but the fact is that they have been very active and I'd say even hectic since March, advancing in this work stream in a very determined and committed way. Thank you very much to Mark, to the working group and to the staff supporting them. It's for sure a very important topic, not that the others are not, but first, this is new. So we have to pay a special attention to this work stream. Secondly, and I'll come back to this topic later, what I can tell you is that from these outreach activities that we have been undertaking since March all over, it is clear that this is the topic. This is something that concerns everybody, irrespective of the sector, irrespective of the jurisdictions, irrespective of their background. This is what everybody wants to discuss. That is causing a lot of attention. Is raising a lot of attention, a lot of enthusiasm, but also a lot of perplexities and questions that are natural in such a new way of looking at corporate information, and that's what we are talking about here. That is raising a lot of questions also from a strategic perspective. Globally, it's not only for us, but globally, because we have questions about who is going to do what, who is going to be allowed to work and perform in this space. What are we going to do with different initiatives being taken by different international organizations or regulators or whatever? We have different proposals coming out from the European Commission, from IESBA, from the SEC. So there is, I think that this is a learning curve, clearly, for everybody, for us, but I think that for the world. And it's more than natural that at certain points in this journey, there will be some doubts, questions, and perplexities. And we have to decide where to go and how to go. So we are, I hope, already part of this movement, of this reality. We are not different from the others, and we have to discuss our own questions and perplexities and form a solid basis at IESBA concerning our positioning, the goals that we are envisaging, and the strategy and tactics to achieve these goals. So I very much hope that together with Mark's presentation and the concrete discussion around what's here on the table to be discussed, approved, etc., I very much urge you to be active and frank and constructive in this discussion. Last thing, and I will stop here, and this is for the whole meeting. We have indeed a very challenging, though exciting agenda. Time is not, time is scarce as always. So I'd ask you to be, of course, constructive, collaborative, open, etc., but as straight to the point as possible, so that we can have time to listen to everybody and to have focused interventions, so that it is possible to take clear conclusions from the discussion. Ken?
Thank you very much, Gabriela. And just a reminder again, we do have public observers in the meeting room, and the volume is not necessarily resonating all the way back to the room. So even Gabriela, I would suggest, if you don't mind, Gabriela, if you could speak to your microphone or bring your microphone closer, but anyone as well, for those especially who don't have a kind of booming voice that carries 5 miles out. I think that would be great.
So, can you hear me better now? Thank you, Ken. So Mark, please, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. We've got a series of slides to talk through, really to give you an update on what the working group's been doing since we met here in March. I can confirm that Deanne and Sylvia have not slept since March, looking at the pace with which things have been developed. And I think just before I start on the presentation, one thing that I'll sort of say up front is that this is an area that is developing at a very fast rate. Things are changing all the time, and one of the things for me as a sort of learning curve of the ways of IESBA is I know that the board likes to define its problems and then to resolve those problems. The challenge here is that sometimes it's difficult to define the problem because it is changing all the time. And indeed, one of the things that came up in discussions only sort of about 10 days ago is in the material that we have for discussion at this meeting, we talk about all of the great things in the code that lend themselves to basically sustainability reporting and sustainability assurance work. And indeed, there's a comment later on in the terms of reference about the importance of section 4B of the code. Of course, it strikes me that a lot of people producing sustainability material and assuring that may already be professional accountants or auditors. And therefore, it begins to raise the question of, well, actually, it's section 4A of the code as well. Because if we want to set a high playing field, a high bar, then those are the sorts of things we need to do. So I think one of the challenges for the working group is not to over-define the problem, because we need to be quite flexible in our approach and how we respond to really making this as valuable a process as it can be. Right. Where am I pointing to with this? Marvelous. Oh, marvelous. Shows it's a good job I'm not on the technology working group, isn't it? So what we want to do is give you an update on the development of our work and indeed the outreach that we've been undertaking. We want to talk you through our proposed terms of reference that were circulated with the papers. We want to get some input from you on the questionnaire that's been developed to send out to our stakeholders to inform work, and also discuss some of the issues that are relevant to the publication of a staff publication later on this year. You've not seen that draft publication yet because it is still a work in progress, and we didn't want to include something in the papers either that would come out and you'd start redrafting, or something in the papers that would come to you late, because we want to show you the direction of travel. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to talk about the staff publication and how that will work. But at the moment, this is sharing with you the working group's thinking and the staff thinking, and looking at where we need to go next. So this just gives you an update on the working group itself. We had our first in-person meeting in London earlier this year. We, on the back of that, have developed the material that you've got today, and also thought about the list of stakeholders that we need to engage with as part of our outreach. And although we'll discuss one particular topic for a staff publication today, there are also a range of other things that we can do to highlight how the code can help this particular work stream. So by way of sort of wider updates and in terms of jurisdictional developments, obviously the main focus at the moment is the exposure drafts that the International Sustainability Standard Board has issued. So two main standards, one on general reporting requirements, one on climate. It builds on TCFD reporting requirements. And it's interesting to see the response to that and how that works in different jurisdictions. And of course, they've also set out their steps to use these standards as the basis for a global baseline for sustainability reporting. And I think that's something that plays exceptionally well to our agenda here at IESBA, because of course we offer a global baseline for high quality, ethical and independent standards that align well with the objectives of the IESB. So that sort of reporting baseline will build upon the existing framework of different reporting requirements that we've had. And of course, the steps that were taken to establish the board means that we are drawing also not just on TCFD, but also on the IESBA sector-specific standards and wider integrated reporting. So the timetable that the IESBA have is very ambitious, but it's not the only thing that is going on at the moment. And Gabriella mentioned the NSS meeting where we had presentations on other initiatives in sustainability reporting. The US SEC currently has a live consultation with a series of proposals about how it is seeking to strengthen reporting and also assurance in this space. And then, of course, in the EU, EFRAG has also set out a series of proposals with European sustainability reporting standards. Now, that's initially caused some concern in our discussions within the working group because, of course, it's important that we have a global baseline and not several baselines. And I think it's important to know that in the latest sort of round of negotiations at the EU level, the so-called trilogue to reconcile the different positions of the Council and the European Parliament, a number of member states pushed back quite strongly about the need for any European reporting framework to basically build on the global baseline. So I hope that is more encouraging news that we have about how this work develops. In terms of the feedback from the NSS meeting, Gabriella already mentioned the presentations that we had. There is very broad support for collaboration between the different standard setting boards. And of course, in those discussions, we stress the importance of ethics and the importance that IESBA has in terms of supporting high quality sustainability reporting and assurance. One of the things that we're hearing very clearly from stakeholders is that they might be agnostic over who does the work, but it's important that that work is carried out to similarly high standards. And that's not only the reporting standards themselves, but it's also the high ethical standards that the code offers and the independence requirements that the code offers. So we've got to make sure that we're demonstrating how IESBA and the code can support that framework by providing that consistent way of working. We also provided the NSS with an update on our work and indeed our timeline and where we were going, which was well received, and recognition that that would continue to develop as we learn more about the particular challenge that we face. We've already mentioned briefly the ESG discussion that we had. That attracted very wide attention and indeed allowed us to frame some of the questions that the working group will have to navigate a way through in developing proposals for the board to consider further. And if you haven't been able to listen to that, there is a recording on the website, so you can actually update yourselves on the issues that were covered off, but very broadly consistent with that message of needing to have a single consistent high benchmark. We've also engaged with the IEESB and with IOSCO, with GRI, and also some more involved discussions with IOSCO and the IEESB about how we ensure the coordination of all of the different initiatives to ensure that we've got material that is ready and able to support reporting as that rolls out. In terms of the terms of reference, so we've got that at agenda item 2A. What we've sought to do is set out the focus and scope for the working group and indeed the priorities and the things that we want to take forward. Very much looking at trying to give a manageable focus to that work because it could expand, and we realise that we can't bite off too much. We've got to be able to respond on a timely basis. And therefore, our work is very much focused on the ethical implications from the production of sustainability information, its reporting, and its assurance. And in doing so, we recognise that the characteristics of that information are very different to what we usually see in financial reporting. This will then be used as the basis to inform any future standard setting activities, as well as, of course, as raising awareness of where the code already has helpful material and indeed important things that practitioners and others can draw upon to drive their work. We've also, in doing that, got to think about this much more diverse group of people who are involved in sustainability reporting and assurance, and indeed what that means for the code itself and its scope. Very quickly, just setting out the 3 stages to our work. So firstly, awareness raising of how the code already helps. And indeed, it's been really good to be able to engage with stakeholders through external events. We'll supplement that shortly with staff guidance that's being developed. We'll then carry out our fact finding and report back to the board, and then also look to see what is required in terms of reviewing the code to deal with sustainability related issues. And I think at the moment, our initial work is reasonably encouraging in terms of the fact that the fundamental principles are well placed to drive that work. We need to help people perhaps apply some of the provisions to the different work that's carried out under this remit. In terms of awareness raising, this sets out our outreach building on what I've already covered off. We are looking at development of guidance to explain the applicability of the code and indeed, how that is helpful. And also we'll build on what we've already done with the webinar that Gabriella mentioned, with looking at other opportunities to engage with our stakeholders and really sort of help them understand how the code drives high quality work in this space. In terms of challenges, so our fact finding, what we don't know is whether or not people who aren't professional accountants are aware of the provisions of the code, not necessarily saying that it will be there as a reference document for them, but they need to be aware of the high standards that it drives. And therefore we need to think about how we reach out to some of the providers of that information and those assurance services to see if we can use this as a way of really drawing attention to the sort of work that the code already supports. And of course, this will help us define the scope of the standard setting work that we might ultimately want to do. But I say very much the message sort of to the board as a whole is we're looking to do this in a let's not boil the ocean. Let's think about how the working group can help the board to maximize the value of what the code already offers in this space. The survey that's already out there includes questions regarding sustainability standard setting actions. The working group has also developed, which is part of the papers for this meeting, a questionnaire to find further information. And we're looking at working collaboratively, of course, with our national standard setter groups, with other regulators, with IFAC and professional bodies as a way of building our understanding, and of course, further research and drawing on the networks as well that the working group members themselves have. In terms of exploring potential revisions, obviously it's very early to be looking at this, but we did want to give you a flavour that we are thinking about the consequences. So you've got there some ideas about how perhaps some of the concepts and the terminology in the code may need to be revised in a way that supports the inclusion of sustainability information. And of course, in doing so, we need to remember that what we're looking at is information that is not derived from systems and control processes that are as strong or mature or as reliable as those that underpin financial reporting. And we'll also look for areas where there are quick wins in terms of enhancement to the code, but again, looking at how do we maximize the value of what we can do. And of course, in reporting back to the board, we'll be looking at providing you with updates as to how future standard setting work can be driven by the insight that we're currently building. In terms of deliverables, we want to be able to provide the board with a quarterly update, not only on awareness raising that we've done, but also our engagement with stakeholders and how the development of our guidance can be taken forward. And ultimately, there'll be a final report that will come at the end of this first stage, which will include final recommendations for the board to consider about how we take forward potential standard setting activity. It will also help us identify the issues that really are the priorities for further consideration of where the code and the material that sits around it can be developed, recognizing that we want to be able to be shown as moving quickly, but in a way that is manageable within the resources and the time that we have. So really, it's over to members here now. We are very keen to have your input in terms of the terms of reference, in terms of the questionnaire that we've got, and indeed also your further thoughts. But I'd encourage you to please remember that this is a challenge that continues to be developed and continues to define itself in very different ways as we look at lots of things going on in different standard setting boards in different jurisdictions. But I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion for us to have. So do we want to pause there and really have a look at the terms of reference now?
I think so, Mark. Thank you very much for this presentation, for this detailed presentation, and for the challenges that it's in one way or another encompasses. I think that we should pause here, probably for a first round of discussions about what you have shared and about the work already undertaken and the plans and proposals of the working group, namely. Taking these questions, the objective and focus of the work stream, the mandate and approach of the working group, and the deliverables. And before opening the floor for the discussion, I think that there were some important topics raised in this presentation. There is a lot of things in your presentation, both about process and substance and strategy as well. But there are some important topics that I think that we could, since the start, consider, namely in respect to some concerning some strategic topics like the problem of fragmentation or convergence or consistency. We are a global standard setter. Mark rightly mentioned and stressed that some initiatives being undertaken by other international organizations or even national organizations against a goal or a purpose which is common to everybody, which is to avoid ending up with a fragmented framework. So how do we position ourselves concerning this concrete question? The question of timeline, Mark also mentioned, and I'm picking up on what you said, mentioned the need to go quick, but make it in a way that it's manageable, considering the resources that we have. And this is probably, and not say the most important problem, because it depends on the decisions that we will take and the priority that we will give to this work stream and the deliverables and the goals that we establish. But indeed, I'd like to share that all these interactions that we have been having with others and let's say with stakeholders only reinforce the idea that this is urgent. And this is urgent in two different ways. It's urgent because it's urgent per se, because we are trying to provide a contribution to a global common goal, which is to provide the world with an appropriate framework for non-financial information, which may help delivering on the United Nations SDG and the overarching purpose of sustainability. But it's also urgent in a more pragmatic way, because the movements and the developments around non-financial information and sustainability are moving so fast that it's important not to be left behind or out this movement. And the big question is if we want to make part of an integrated system, how can we manage to be there on time to effectively integrate this system and not leave an empty space or space for other things to happen. Also, the possible expansion of the scope of the code, picking up on something that Mark somehow also mentioned, the idea that some non-professional accountants can be providing the same services. And in our strategy and work plan survey, we made the question to our stakeholders about whether we should or not consider the possibility of expanding the scope of the code so as to make it applicable to all those providing the same services. And this is a question, this is not an answer or a statement, it's a real, honest question being made to the stakeholders. Should we consider, and if the answer is yes, and we are not anticipating a final answer, the next answer is how, which is probably much more difficult than the response to the first question. And also terminology, of course, it's important, as Mark started saying, it's important to define the scope of the work while things are moving so fast, but it's also necessary to have a common lexicon, a common terminology, so as to make sure that we are talking about the same things. Of course, avoiding the trap of being stuck in the discussion of terminology and not being able to progress in the substance of the thing. I'm just launching a few topics for discussion, which are alongside the substance and the process. So we have, to my view, we have here three questions: the strategy and the goals, the process, how, and the substance, of course, what are we going to do? And with this, I'll open the floor for the discussion. I see that Mark wants to add something.
I just wanted to add to what you said there, Gabriella, and that is what we know from the stakeholder engagement we've done already is that sustainability information is being used for capital allocation decisions. So if it's being used for capital allocation decisions, it needs to be as reliable as financial information that traditionally has been used solely for capital allocation decisions. And so therefore, if people are to have confidence in sustainability reporting and its assurance, they need to know that the framework of standards that it relies upon is as reliable. And I think what's been positive in terms of our engagement is that this has been something that we've raised with a number of different groups, and they perhaps hadn't directly thought of it, but as soon as we say it, everyone shares that common interest and the need for a level playing field. And you know, I think that we can do a lot already through that awareness raising about the benefit that the code brings. But I say, I'm not getting any pushback from stakeholders that we speak to, that we are in any way sort of heading in a wrong direction. There's a lot of support for it.
I fully agree. Ken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairwoman. I don't want to detract from what Mark has presented in terms of discussion this morning, the terms of reference to the working group, the plan for non-authoritative material, the stakeholder questionnaire, etc. These are all important items for which it would behoove the board to provide relevant and useful feedback to the working group to take this forward. But Gabriela has touched on a very important strategic question for the board, and that is the question of timing. And that is that we should not ignore that this is really front and center on the radar screen of our stakeholders. Just about 10 days ago, we had a call with IESBA and our colleagues on IESBA, and the question was asked very directly to us: is there any capacity within IESBA's strategy and work plan to fast track standard setting? That was a direct question that was posed to our board do we have any capacity, do we have any flexibility to accommodate any standard setting project to address the need and the demand for standards from the ethics and independence perspective to support where the market is going. So that is a broader strategic issue for this board to consider, quite apart from whatever else is on the table for discussion today. And just for context also, I think, and it's important to understand where the code stands today. As most of you, if not all of you will know, the code contains independence standards, international independence standards that are in two parts of the code. In part 4A, these are the standards, the independent standards for audits of financial statements, and these have been well established, long established and accepted, and currently used. And then in part 4B of the code, these are the independent standards that address assurance engagements. And these standards in part 4B were issued about 15 years ago. That's the history. They were issued 15 years ago when the board back then, in its wisdom, felt that it needed to have a clearer distinction between audits and other assurance engagements. Audits in the sense that these are standards of assurance, these are assurance engagements that serve very significant, very important public interest goals. And therefore, it was necessary to come up with a set of standards that would deal with audits of financial statements. And therefore, for other types of assurance engagements, we needed a different set of standards, lighter touch, so to speak, in quotes, lighter touch independent standards that would sit in a different part of the code. And these are the standards that are currently in part 4B. The question for the board is whether those standards as they stand today are fit for purpose to serve the needs of the capital markets in terms of assurance engagements and sustainability information. Put it another way, is it appropriate to use the standards for an assurance engagement to report on sustainability information, and that information is going to be used by, let's say, ESG raters to inform capital allocation decisions, as well as an assurance engagement for a local charity that is looking for some assurance in terms of how much it should be paying in terms of royalties, for example, because it's using let's say, trademark in order to raise funds. And that is a question, you know, in effect, there is an important issue of really whether we need to distinguish the level of public interest, whether that distinction is made currently in part 4B. And that is not the case today. An assurance engagement, as I say, that is being asked by a small charity would be subject to the same independent standards currently in part 4B as a sustainability assurance for a large global listed entity that is reporting on its sustainability information. And that is a state of play today, and it is a very strategic question for the board. And as I indicated, the question that's been put to us by the regulatory community is, IESBA, do you have any flexibility? What is your game plan in terms of fast tracking standard setting to respond to the need?
Thank you very much, Ken. I'd just like to add that this was the case as well in the last outreach activities that I undertook last week and with Financial Stability Board and the monitoring group. The question is there. I think the impression, very frankly, that I have is that there is a lot of interest in what IESBA is doing. It's providing those who will have to make decisions on this space with the idea that there is someone that can do something. And when Mark says that the question was not that much there about the importance of having assurance, but once we speak about that, that nobody says no. The question, I think, is more than for them, yes, but who is going to do it? Who is going to make it? And the fact is that there is a lot of attention, I think, in what IESBA is doing and can do, but a clear question about what and when. And the when is critical and strategical because, of course, the global framework will not wait for us in case we are not able to provide them with what they need on time, if that is the case.
I think Ken sets out the case very well, and I think that's why in my opening comment I made the point about the tension between 4B and 4A, and it is that I'm not saying that 4B is not in any way fit for purpose, but there's a recognition, as you say, Ken, that there is audit, then there are other public interest assurance engagements, which is a term that we've sort of employed, you know, with my UK hat on, that recognises that other public interest assurance engagements are at a higher tier, perhaps more akin to the audit threshold than, as you say, particular regulatory or less, less comprehensive assurance engagements. And that's why personally I lean towards 4A, because it provides a stronger and perhaps more developed framework than 4B. But you wouldn't want to take 4B away, because actually it drives some very high quality work in areas that are really important, including some of the ones that you mentioned. So that's where it is sort of in my mind. And I expect that one of the things that, you know, this discussion will lead to is that I expect the working group will need to get together again in person to really sort of navigate a way through some of these. But sorry.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And now I think let's listen to the board members. Rich, please.
Yeah, I echo what Mark just said. Whether 4B is valuable, it addresses standards that should be followed for assurance for many types of activities. But my sense is similar to what Mark said, and he said it far better than I will, that it's going to be in the public interest that there be a more encompassing set of standards that govern the independence issues against whoever is providing, whether you call it audit or assurance services, over the sustainability disclosures, whatever those might develop into. And so I don't know. I think we have to think hard about 4A as being the choice. There is one practical plus to that. If we choose that, we could move pretty fast, right, in terms of setting a standard, because there doesn't need to be a lot of words as to what the restrictions are. You can reference the sections in 4A after you set the groundwork. But I'm also sensitive that there have been some initiatives around the world already that go beyond what 4A would provide. And so I do think we have to at some point try to explain to those bodies what our philosophy is and why it's that way if we're going to go to 4A. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Christelle, please.
My point was also on this subject, and I wonder if we can have a sort on a pragmatic approach, because I feel that there is a set of conditions to get to a 4A ability, not from the point of the assurance provider, but from the point of view of the production of the information. And that what we can do in a full audit on financials, which has been for decades maturing in companies that want to raise capital. We are not, in some circumstances, we're far from the situation of having all those set of conditions to get to it. So it would probably cause some important disruptions, even maybe this confidence on companies that have been doing very well on their financials, but are on a learning curve on other informations. And so I wonder if we could upfront have a reflection about, well, there is a target, and this is the time frame where we feel that it would be possible because we have engaged with our stakeholders. And so the time by which the 4A would be the reference. But in going into that target, we acknowledge that companies need to go to a certain level. Maybe other actors, non-PA assurance providers would have to improve their abilities, etc. And I think it could be a part of the reflection.
Thank you, Christelle. Caroline.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks, Mark, for the presentation. So my comment is just going to address this question about 4A and 4B. So I think we do have a structure of the code that we should abide by and observe. And that structure is very much linked to the assurance and auditing standards. So in the event that IESBA, treats the work around sustainability information as part of coming under the audit of the financial statements, maybe because of the integration of financial, non-financial information for purposes of audit and disclosure, then I think at that point in time, it would fit under 4A. But at this point in time, without the IESBA putting it or classifying that sustainability information in that manner, it would be, I think, a challenge for us to create or extend 4A to cover sustainability information. Another reason why I say that is that whether that assurance is reasonable assurance or limited assurance, at this point in time, it's not clear as well. And there are certain standard setters who are saying that, we'll start with limited assurance and over time, then move across to reasonable assurance. So our code has to be responsive to that and acknowledge that the level of assurance might not be reasonable assurance, that it could be limited assurance. So we have to make sure that our code is scalable or flexible in that sense. And so with that, my view is that I would agree with where Ken seemed to be alluding to, which is that maybe there is a need for us to relook at 4B and think about whether within 4B we need to have public interest assurance engagements versus non-public interest assurance engagements, and use that as the demarcation or the separation between where we have a more extensive set of requirements and standards that would meet the use of information for capital allocation. And I do recognize that sustainability information is actually used not just for capital allocation by investors. That information actually has a lot of interest to consumers in deciding, which businesses they want to support, to the workforce in deciding their choice when it comes to companies they want to work for, as well as service providers in terms of who they want to be associated with. So I think, and if you think about it, governments as well, where do they want to allocate their budget spend? So I think sustainability information and the ethical implications go beyond just capital allocation. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. This is very helpful. Angie, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the task force and the working group. And I certainly do completely endorse us doing this on a speedy basis, because it is an important topic. And there's a lot to unpack there, and a lot of what we've been discussing lately has been the independence standards. And certainly, there's a lot of heavy lifting that the IESB is going to have to do with in terms of anything special towards that. But in terms of the independence issues, I know it's been raised in some corners as to whether or not the people who provide assurance, the PAs who provide assurance on the financial statements, are also appropriate to provide assurance on sustainability information. And from where I sit, I'm not sure I see that as a problem. But I think it would be helpful to the world if the code were to address that in terms of say in non-assurance standards. Some of that does create an independence issue, but is this one that would create an independence issue? I'm intrigued by the paper when it refers to the non-PAs doing this work. I'm thinking of our tax task force, where there are a lot of non-PAs who do tax planning consulting, and many of those groups do have also their own regulatory scheme and ethical scheme, such as attorneys. And so I think the reach of the IESBA, primarily because of the A at the end of us, is the professional accountants. But I've always been intrigued by the assurance standards, which say that non-PAs, if there's a regulatory scheme and if they assert that they are following the assurance standards, can use those standards. So I recognize the materials say there's little information. I certainly would love to know if anyone who is not a PA is providing that representation. But in terms of the capital markets, I think in general, most of the assurance that is being used to facilitate capital markets is not market driven. Perhaps it was originally market driven, but it is for the most part regulatory driven, that there are requirements on the regulatory scheme for certain assurance that must be provided on those representations. I think we have a different situation here, is that I think the market is to a large extent saying we want this information. And so that is creating a big free-for-all in having information come out that it isn't so much tapped from both the professional accountant in business, to the extent that they are involved in the preparation and presentation. And I was intrigued that the paper referred to a lot about the preparation and presentation, because that wouldn't be a 4A, 4B part. That would be the 5 fundamental principles. And so that you seem to have a lot of projects, and one of those and before there's assurance, there needs to be the preparation of the information. And so I would encourage to look at a fit for purpose to make sure that the ethical standards with regard to that are fit for purpose. But certainly I hope we're working, and I expect we're working very closely with the IAASB on the assurance perspective. But I do agree that the 4B assurance standards probably does take a look, as Caroline just mentioned, about whether or not there should be a public interest focus with regard to some of the assurance. Not all assurance standards are created equal, because some have greater impact in the public interest, and so I think it is appropriate for us to take a look at that perspective. So anyway, a lot to unpack there, a lot of work for us to do, and I certainly encourage it. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Luigi, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the presentation you did, Mark. It is really consistent with what I was expecting and let's say my view on this matter, and therefore I support everything you said in the presentation, and even the terms of reference. I fully agree with that. I can only say a few words on a certain matter that was already discussed during other comments. First of all, probably the time that you are figuring out is, as already you mentioned twice or three times, it is pretty challenging because if we are waiting for the completion of this activity before starting thinking how to amend the code, how to update the provision in the code, this would require, probably considering the due process we need to implement, this would probably require 2-3 years in order to get completed. Because if you start, for example, June next year, we will have the exposure draft phase, the collection of the feedbacks, and so on and so forth. And therefore, it would be very difficult to have something in place, let's say, before 2024, 2025, probably, which is something that, it is a scenario, but probably we should search for another scenario in order to accelerate a bit the process. And therefore, I also ask you whether there is anything we as a board can do in order to support you and, let's say, to put your working group in a situation to be able to try to accelerate a bit the work. Second point, as already Andy mentioned, I think that one of the things we can start doing before that point is to review the part, the ethics part of the code, in order to understand whether it fit for purpose in terms of preparation of the information and in terms of assuring this information. I will not say that it is easier than the independence part, but at least it is something we can start now without waiting too much, probably, in order to perform this work. There is a complexity here. Most of those that are preparing this information are not professional accountants, and therefore still there are intersection with other comment you did during your presentation. But I think that this type of work could start probably soon than the other one. And the last comment with reference to independent standard, I agree that the current Par 4B probably is not sufficiently updated, I would not say strong, updated, in order to deal with the new challenges that users have in using this information. So far, I'm not able to state which would be the end state, but there is a need at least to think about different scenario and to try to figure out which scenario it is best fitted for the purpose and which one could be achieved sooner than others.
Thank you very much, Luigi. Jens, please.
Thank you, Gabriella. I just want to add the preparation part of the discussion, because you all have witnessed 6 days ago in Germany, DWS has suffered some public messaging because German prosecutors said that sufficient factual evidence, I'm citing, has emerged that ESG factors were taken into account in a minority of investments, but were not taken into account at all in a large number of investments, contrary to statements of DWS. So you see, there is an ethical issue in the preparatory world, and we cannot wait. Such a case is demonstrating that we should, in this case, I think there's no change of the code necessary, but just to highlight how such and similar cases have to be dealt with from the perspective of the code. So I think there is a possibility of a Q&A and other kind of supporting paper. Having read then the sustainability report of DWS, which has not been audited or no assurance have been given to, I think the second question is, there is a lot of information outside without any assurance. So the starting point now would be, I think Caroline mentioned it, in Europe we have this trend of starting with limited assurance and then getting reasonable assurance. I think my analysis is 4B is there, but we should have 4C or something else and I think there is something more than guidance material necessary. And we could include the challenging question where there is a conflict between being the auditor or assurance provider for financial information versus being the provider of non-financial assurance. And you have heard that European Parliament is of the view that this is a conflict. There might be a conflict. I have no clear picture on that, but there is an ongoing discussion, and I think the board should consider and start a process how to enrich or enhance 4B as a 4B plus, the first step, and then look if what Christelle said, a more mature environment is there and the market is looking for reasonable assurance, probably we will somehow then will go towards 4A, and that's why I'm saying perhaps we should start with a separate discussion on 4B plus and then see how we can develop further. That would be, I think, a good process to be very quick and responsive, because to make 4A as a part for sustainability reporting is a huge issue, and I think a step-by-step approach would be appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens. If I may, just to make sure that everybody is aware of the what has been mentioned by Mark and by Jens concerning this discussion being held at the European Commission about the possibility of keeping auditors at bay from assuring non-financial information of the firms to which they are assuring the financial information. Probably most of you are aware of that, but just in a very quickly, there is indeed a discussion, and there was a proposal from the European Parliament in that direction, that the auditors who are performing audit assurance, assurance of financial information are prohibited from performing the assurance of non-financial information. A decision has not been made. As Jens mentioned, there are some alleged conflicts of interest justifying this, at least the proposal. But of course, there are also market reasons. This is said to be meant to be a way of opening the market to other providers, smaller firms, etc. The discussion is there. Of course, we are not the ones making the decisions, but we have to be prepared for whatever can the decision be in this respect. Sorry for this interruption. Chana, please.
Thanks, Gabriela. Thanks, Mark, for your presentation. A lot of work has gone into it. I think picking up on what Luigi said and Jen said, I wonder whether the June 2023 is too far down the track, and because with the speed some of these things are moving, whether we might need to be open to moving faster. And then I know that sort of there's an issue over resources as well. with Part 4A and 4B, I mean, there's a provision already in Part 4B, Section 900.10, which says that if you do audit or review, you're forced back into 4A. So that already exists in the code. But I do agree that with what Ken was saying, that 4B is probably not fit for purpose, and we may need to beef it up or have another part like a 4C. In respect of expanding this code to to I think it comes back to an issue of monitoring and enforcement as well, to ensure quality. In Australia, we have a situation where the code is applicable to anyone who do a statutory audit, doesn't have to be a member of an accounting body. And the Clean Energy Regulator has also mandated that it's the code plus 3,000 that they need to do for audit. So, already if you can get the regulatory support, the regulators can mandate that that is what you need to use, and you don't need to be a member of an accounting body. In Australia, we also have within the CA firms affiliate members. So that is if you're a partner, but not a member of one of the accounting bodies, there's a category that Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand give you to make you a member of the body. So I sort of recall what Sasha said at that webinar as well, Gabriela, where he said, historically we may have first done the reporting, then the assurance, and then the ethics to go on top of it. But the way things are moving, you may need to work concurrently on these things. So, but it comes back to resourcing, but wherever we can, if we can even get some minor improvements, I think that would be good. Thanks.
Thank you, Chana. That's very helpful and informative as well. It's important to know what's going in the different jurisdictions concerning the topics that we are addressing more globally. That's helpful. Thank you very much. Sadia, please.
So firstly, I just want to congratulate the working group for their various initiatives. The recent webinar and the outreach events are admirable. While we are moving very fast with this topic, I also appreciate that we have a lot to cover. And I just wanted to make note that finding the right public interest topics is important in this area. It will allow us to focus our attention to the right issues instead of covering all the issues, which I'm sure are all important, but not at the same level. Andy just mentioned that there are various stakeholders or role players in this realm, and we need to just make sure that we're giving equal attention to all of them. We have considered Part 4B and Part 4A, and I won't repeat the comments made, but I just make mention that at the moment, the code doesn't differentiate between limited and reasonable assurance. If you are engaged in assurance, then you follow the same type of requirements for independence because of the type of entity. And I hope we respect that type of structure going forward. I appreciate the working group has a lot to cover. And as we cover, I hope we look for opportunities to leverage off others. So has the research been done? Can we work with others in collaborative initiatives? This will allow us to move faster, but also allow the working group to reach the right level of decision making. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sadia. Jumpai.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. Mark, thank you very much for your presentation. I have one thing I would like to mention. This is deliverables and timing shown in terms and reference. I understand that IESBA is going to finalize the S1 general requirements for disclosure and climate-related disclosure in 2022. And also, the regulatory bodies in the United States and the EU are also preparing their rules. I believe it is very important that IESBA release deliverables and review the code in a timely manner. I'd like IESBA to communicate with regulatory bodies and understand the needs and demands from several stakeholders, so that IESBA will release deliverables and review the code at the appropriate timing. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Junpei. Brian.
Thanks. So I'm very supportive of the direction that the Sustainability Working Group has been going so far. I think it's excellent. I'm also supportive of the comments that I've heard in terms of that's the issues around, and I appreciate the issues around 4A and 4B. I would prefer a 4B plus kind of stepped approach. I think it just fits better in that area, but I understand obviously that it does require a bunch of work to kind of bring us to that point. But nonetheless, it just seems to sort of fit better in that area, at least for me. We've heard a lot about the issues around, and this is to the really to the terms of reference, a lot of issues around producing and reporting, and then the assurance on sustainability work. And I actually wanted to take a step back. So Andy was talking about focusing on the A in PA, and I'm thinking about the P in PA and the broader public interest issues around sustainability, and whether or not, and I think we can, but it's how we can use the code as a bit of an additional push to bring sustainable decision making into the realm of PAs, to encourage them to make sustainable decisions within their organizations, which will end up producing a more sustainable environment and so on, and help address climate change issues. So what can we do in that area? And I think having some focus there around the decision making of PAs, particularly within PAIBs, who are responsible for things like budgeting and making really ethical leadership decisions around sustainability. How can the code be leveraged to encourage that sort of thing right from the get-go, even before we're producing and reporting information and so on? Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Kaylin, please.
Excuse me, I think Anya has.
Okay, let's go. Please.
You were there first, Dean, so I was happy to wait. Just some very few points about it. First of all, about the fragmentation. The purpose that we have with IESBA is for a global standard for sustainability reporting, as opposed to SEC and the European Parliament that is for local application. Of course, those who are related in those markets will be subjected to the same regulation, but there is a difference between what IESBA is proposing and what SEC and even the European Parliament is proposing. And talking with their representatives once, they told me that it is okay that it is so, because the IESBA will be a global standard, so it's for general application, and they can require more. They just cannot require less than what IESBA as a global standard setter will be doing. So that's the first thing. And secondly, no standard setter in this scenario has the answer for all the questions. So I think that is one of the motives that we are more encouraged to join forces with other standard setters. Yes, but do not have all the answers. IESBA will not have them. IESBA will not have them. So we should come together. And I think that the same we can say about the use of PAs and non-PAs. Accountancy is there for many decades, and we still do not have perfect regulation about that. So, but they have experience. So that's why I understand sustainability reporting linked to integrated reporting and getting remembered. That was always my battle. If it is linked to accountancy, the information and the possibility of tracking the origin of the information in order to make auditing possible will be there. And I agree finally with Caroline in one thing. We are not just here to think about the investor's interest, because we are trying to use sustainability reporting as a tool in order to have a better world. So we do not want to protect the investments of the investors. We want the management of the companies to think not only financially, but to think in the outcomes of their financial decisions upfront. So we want the integrated thinking into place. And that's something that we should have in mind in order to help them, because this is risk management. And that is also a reason why we cannot wait. Because if we leave for the other standard setters to work on that, and then we realize there are some ethical aspects that were not taken into consideration, it'll be too late to introduce them. And so we need to be there in a timely basis. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanya. Galen, we still have Yao Shu. So following your orientation, I will give the floor to Yao Shu and then to you, okay? Yao Shu, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mark. I agree that to some extent, we can't make the decision. For example, at the level of ESG assurance, we can't make the decision, for example, the reasonable or limited assurance, but I think we can be ready for the decision. There are a lot of things that we need to consider and discussion. And I think to some extent that I think the ESG problem may be the same with, the pie definition, because we can't amplify that's the scope of our job. We just want to focus to some objective. And for example, the financial condition and something about that, we cannot apply that's the PA's objective. And I agree that Part 4B is fit for the purpose. I don't think to make big change is a good idea. And I think we can add some provisions in Part 4B. Thank you.
Thank you, Yao Shu. And finally, Galen, please.
Thank you very much. And what a terrific conversation. I appreciate everything that's been said. And I'll try to make my comments very brief, just because I know we're short on time, but I do agree with very much with what Caroline said about the public interest importance of that component. Maybe there's a way to approach it from that standpoint. Maybe there are 3 parts of 4. Okay, so and I do, but at the same time, I also agree with what Sadia said about the ethics standards. They apply appropriately to both limited assurance as well as reasonable assurance. I think that's a great comment. I think all of this sort of emphasizes the importance of outreach. And we can say that the code should be expanded, but what will really make that happen is other players like IESBA, like the PIOB, like the European Union, like the SEC and so forth. And so I think it's important that we gain that authority from those folks, not from us just saying, well, now the code has been expanded. I do favor expanding the code, and I think it does need to be fast-tracked. One of the thoughts that I had in mind, and Jen's raised a case in Germany. There was a case last week that the SEC came out with. A company had been making all sorts of representations about ESG when in fact nothing had been done, and they were fined $1.5 million. I think one of the things that the working group might be able to do is establish sort of a database of all of these sorts of things that are cropping up now in the beginning, and start focusing on those, and might involve greenwashing, but all sorts of sort of ethical issues that are arising, and be able to point to those and say, have we addressed this with the code? So that would be one of my recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Galen. And I don't see anyone else. Vanya, oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Robert, please.
Thank you, Gabriella, and hello to everyone. Gabriella, it's a pleasure to be observing my first meeting with you as the chair of the IESBA, although of course it's not the first time other board members have seen me as the observer. It's nice to be back, but I'm very sorry I can't be with you in New York this time. I hope next time I observe I will be able to be. Thank you very much for the discussion today, and I just thought I would intervene now, Gabriella, just following Galen as the CAG chair, and really just to reinforce what he has said, and really what others have said this morning as well. It's been a very good discussion, and it's great to see the working group and now the board getting to grips with the topic, recognising the public interest elements of this and the very important leadership elements of it. From the POB's perspective, the POB is very supportive of this work and this project. It's a critical mission for IESBA, very important to coordinate with the IAASB as far as assurance is concerned, and with the other standard setters, the ISSB, Europe, SEC, and I also was able to had the privilege of participating in the NSS meeting and listening to the presentation a few weeks ago from the three reporting standard developers, and that was most helpful and a great input into the discussion. And I think the other thing that was clear from that discussion, and it's clear again today, is that this is not just an issue about the accounting profession. It's about the public interest in reporting on matters which are multidisciplinary as far as the skills that are required are concerned. And while the accounting profession can provide some very important leadership, it's also important for the profession and the standard setters, and that includes this board, to recognise that others are involved and other frameworks are involved. So I think the work that the IESBA is doing to reach out to challenge itself and to challenge others to look at the benefits of a global leading code with its strengths, particularly in respect of independence, but also all of the other great matters that are covered in the code, is very important. So the POB, I think, would be very supportive of the terms of reference of the working group, which are on the agenda for today. I know you haven't turned to them as yet, but the raising awareness, the fact finding, and providing recommendations to inform future standard setting or other initiatives is a very appropriate and well-balanced set of priorities. It does seem to me to, and others have said this, to look first at the reporting context. That's the greenwashing, and Galen, I know you and other forums have referred to it as fraud, and I think it's important to recognise the significance and the seriousness of that topic. And given that there is this move apace to develop the reporting standards, What's important, obviously, is that professional accountants who are involved in doing that reporting understand what their ethical obligations are in doing it. And so that's what brings the priority into looking at greenwashing, and that may well just be awareness raising rather than, as someone has said, any need to make any great change to the code. And Chair, just quickly on engagement, that's obviously a very significant area of interest for the PIOB as well. It's very encouraging to see a wide approach to engagement being considered here, and of course it's a topic that's especially deserving of that because so many different groups and different frameworks are already involved and engaged. The regulatory community will doubtless have a view and be able to help on the question that's been raised today about parts 4A and 4B. And I think in responding to your challenge, Chair, about timing, and I was going to raise timing today, but it's great to see that coming from the floor of the meeting today. And so we'll certainly look forward to seeing how the working group responds on both the timing issue and the priority of the various topics. And I think someone else did also say that it's important in the engagement to look to the users as well. And of course, that's always a challenge, but it's very important, obviously, with this topic as well. So I'd just like to be encouraging, Chair, and thank you very much for the opportunity to make these brief remarks.
Thank you very much, Robert, for these encouraging words. It's important to know that the PIOB is supporting this work stream. We will need the support of everybody, and one of the questions on the table is how are we going to make this happen, and how can each of us help this happening? But Mark, before I try to wrap up this conversation, which is not going to be easy, do you want to add anything on your side? What does it bring you, considering your proposals on the work and considerations of the working group?
No, this has been a hugely helpful discussion. So I'm very grateful for the input that we've received, and it is one of those challenges of starting from a building that doesn't even have a skeleton, much less anything else that we need to sort of put in place. The working group will reflect, obviously, on the feedback from the board and ensure that we take into account that. I think we need to discuss how we balance the challenge of basically having a sort of terms of reference that basically says the working group will deal with the ethical implications of sustainability, which there is a need to be all encompassing to something that is manageable. And indeed, I think what I will try to propose and see if we can arrange is a further in-person meeting of the working group, hopefully before the summer, to allow us to develop this with view to bringing back more concrete proposals to the board in September, including specifically some of the issues that have been talked about, that both Galen and Robert talked about, in terms of how we address the greenwashing question through the staff article. I won't say anything more about the terms of reference other than to reflect on the fact that they will continue to develop as we develop this work stream. And when I listen to some of the contributions from colleagues here, the reason that production is so important to me is at the moment the IESBA has put out a standard on general reporting and a standard on climate. And both of those have got reasonably well established production phases. When you begin to get into things like biodiversity and some of the other thematic standards that will follow from the IESBA, production and how that's governed will become even more important, because there perhaps may be less input from the professional accountancy community and more input from others. But I think that's all I want to say at this stage, Gabriella. And obviously we've also got within this item as well the other documents also to get board input on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. James, please.
Thank you. I think I was struck by the dilemma that we're facing, and Robert, I think maybe made the dilemma even clearer, but maybe not intentionally. Obviously, the terms of reference and the plan is eminently logical, and I think it's impeccably sequenced. Outreach, fact finding, issues developments, and recommendations, and a basis for future standard setting work. And I think, Mark, you've just identified as well the need to act quickly, to wireframe it, to put forward hypotheses, and then think of what does standard setting look like and the implications for the standards, and to be agile. I'd just share the experience with the IESB where they were in your position coming out of their early meeting this year. They had a plan and put it on public record that their first efforts will be global roundtables, outreach, issue identification, delving into those items. What is developing now is perhaps a more agile way of approaching it. Those are all important activities. But they're working on, in the first instance, wireframing. What does the future standards potentially look like? How do they fit? The part C idea that we've generated today. What are the elements of those standards? Is it limited or reasonable? Pick one, wireframe it, identify the main provisions that need to be addressed, and start contemplating where and the boundaries of any potential types of requirements. And this is all being done on a very agile, rapid basis. And I just encourage that that the terms of reference, I think, are good, but I think it will provide the working group a dilemma, because that list of activities is substantive. It's going to take an amount of time, and it's going to take a lot of the, I think, full-time resource of the working group to move forward as articulated. I think there's a need to pivot and perhaps be a bit agile and think about what the wireframe, the standards, the developments may look like. I would describe that as putting forward something to which people will come to our table to discuss. And I think that may be a different avenue than our normal approach on recommendations for the basis for future standard setting work. It's a bit ambitious, it's a bit aggressive, but it does provide, I think, a visual, an articulation, and a vision of where we see standards development potentially. So I just encourage, I think that's the dilemma Mark has described. I think that's the challenge that we've received from the PIOB. I would err on the latter and allow the outreach and the fact finding and the recommendations to come after we've modeled potential room for standard setting. So just, I think, guidance for the task force to think a little bit about and for the board to reflect on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Ken, did you want to add something?
Well, thank you, Gabriela. Really, it's just to again be reminded of the time frame under which we are in effect operating now, recognizing the other two pillars that will support this global framework, this unified global framework that will support sustainability reporting and assurance, in the sense that we're going to have these standards from the IESBA, we're going to have the standards from IESBA, and then there is a bit of a placeholder with respect to the ethics and independence. And where the IESBA is kind of moving, and James mentioned the sort of agile way of sort of operating on their side, they've signaled already exposure drafts by September next year. And that's basically the dilemma for this board. If you were to wait until June next year to have recommendations to then decide what we do, we're going to be 12 months to 18 months behind the curve. And IESCO will be looking to endorse the standards of IESBA, the new standards from IESBA, and then the sort of what if from IESBA. So that's a bit of the sort of the pressure and the dilemma that we have to think through and come up with a bit of a game plan.
Thank you, Ken. So, Mark, it's easy, don't you think? Okay, so what I take from this discussion, and I will not take long, the first thing is obviously that I think that there is a strong agreement around the table about the need to move fast and quick in this space. I didn't heard any pushback or anything against that. On the contrary, there is a strong incentive coming from the board and from the PIOB as well, for us to think about how to make it happen for all the reasons, and I will not repeat, but one of them is that we have to make sure that in this integrated space and ecosystem that Ken mentioned, together with the other standard setters, that we are ready at the same time to make part of this structure and provide what is necessary. So of course it is easier to say than to do, and the board must be conscious and aware that this will take some efforts and contribution from the board members and the board as such as well. Namely, we may have to reallocate resources, rethink some strategies, some structures, etc. Of course, we will not neglect what will come from the responses to the strategy and work plan that we will receive by July, somewhere by July. And of course, the contributions of our stakeholders must also be incorporated in our strategy. But I think that, as James was saying, since we have an agreement that we have to do it, and we have to do it quick, we have to be aggressive and ambitious. And so we have to start just like we are doing, working before we have all the elements, all the knowledge, and all the data and information that we will need, of course, to bring it to the end. So I think this is the main outcome, the main takeaway of this discussion. Then there was a lot of discussion in between part 4A, part 4B, and a possible part 4C. I think that the working group will have to take this into consideration as well and see how to better move. But the good thing, I think, is that the fact that the board members very quickly went into this discussion about should it be part 4B, should it be part 4A, is that it shows that there is a pre-commitment and a pre-understanding that we have to do something there. So this is what I take from this discussion. Nobody said it expressly, but I think it was the condition, the precondition, and the pre-thinking of all of you when discussing whether it should be part 4A and part 4B. And so the second conclusion is not only that we have to move fast, but also that we have to do something in respect to this part of the code, which, of course, providing already some material and some basis may not be, and is probably not, fit to provide all the necessary support to those acting in this space. Third takeaway, some of the board members are also concerned about the fact that we may be paying a lot of attention to the independence and part and forgetting a little bit about the preparers and the preparation part, and that we should be at the same time developing something concerning the ethics principles, etc., for the preparers. And the working group will have to consider this as well when thinking how to take all these takeaways on board. Finally, and I think this would be my last comment on integration, coordination with other standard setters and the other initiatives. I think that this is also for the working group to think a little bit, but of course we have to keep on talking, keeping this dialogue, this open dialogue with other standard setters, and make sure, of course, it is not IESBA's goal or intention to compete or to overlap or whatever. We we are only aware that we have a role to play there, and our role is to provide another layer, an integrated additional layer to this complex system of sustainability information and assurance on the ethics part, where we are indeed the main global standard setter. And I think, unless any of you, Mark or Ken, James, want to add anything, I think these are the main takeaways. And then, as I said, Mark, it's easy.
Yeah, thank you. Can you not recruit any quicker, Ken? So just very quickly, really, to try and sort of maximise the time that we have available. That's really helpful. We have also developed a stakeholder questionnaire, and the idea is that that is intended to provide us with a consistent way of going out there and dealing with our stakeholders and doing the engagement that we need to do. It's in the papers. I suggest that given that that is quite detailed and it covers different scenarios for different groups of stakeholders, and we will of course refresh it as we have further conversations and identify other areas of interest, that if you've got comments on the detailed aspects, perhaps we can share those with Sylvia so the working group can keep updated and to look at those. It is an important one for us, but it is more in the detail than perhaps we need to discuss around the board table. I think possibly the more significant aspect is we are working on a staff publication that will cover greenwashing. This again poses a challenge because, of course, you know, although that first bullet talks about unintentional acts leading to greenwashing, the scope of what might be greenwashing is incredibly broad, and we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of that, but at the same time we've got something that is targeted and relevant to the context of the code. The purpose of this article will be, of course, to demonstrate how the code assists with the preparation and assurance of sustainability information, and indeed how proper application of the fundamental principles of the code offers a degree of protection against the risk of greenwashing, which I think is really important. We intend to supplement that with a Q&A that's intended to also provide wider material to engage with stakeholders. And what we've done on the next couple of slides is set out specific risks to be identified. Now, this comes from sort of some early discussions that we had, which is when you're looking at greenwashing as an issue, what are the sort of characteristics of the risks that you're seeking to identify? And they're explained on this slide and the next slide to reflect the fact that we're looking at inconsistent reporting at the moment. We're looking at greater estimation uncertainty about much of what gets what is reported, that the quality and the reliability of the underlying data, how does this support high quality reporting and indeed assurance? And what's there in terms of sufficient appropriate evidence to back up what's reported over sustainability performance. And on the next slide, of course, you also have the questions around timing, the questions about connectivity between those different risks and how they will continue to develop. And of course, I think probably we're looking to anchor this very much in the fundamental principles. So therefore, where does the pressure come to breach those fundamental principles? And then we recognize that there is a very particular risk here about how do we address the fact that information that's produced to support sustainability reporting might in fact be perhaps at best misleading, at worst non-compliant with law or regulation, but recognizing that very broad framework. And I think that we've got a timeline really for the staff review, for the staff publication that would look to develop something that would go out in the autumn, because there is some work to be done on that, and we want to make sure that we've got something that lands well and that all board members can be comfortable with. So publication in September, and I think that I would leave it there and use the remainder of the time in this session to offer any board members the chance to give their thoughts on this, recognizing that, you know, it is a critical topic, and as Jens said earlier, something that's very relevant to all of us at the moment. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And now open the floor for comments. As Mark said, I think that the detailed comments on the detail of the questionnaire should be left for individual contributions or suggestions sent to the working group or to Sylvia. But we would like to hear you about the broader question of the questionnaire. Sunam, please.
Yes, thank you. I looked at the questionnaires, and there are six questionnaires for respondents. One of them is from preparers. I think it's well prepared, but one thing I'd like to add comment is there is a question, who is preparing the reports? Here, I'd like to, I think we need to be more specific, asking something like that, which department is responsible for gathering information and preparing the sustainability related information, given that I believe that there are other departments or other than people, other than finance. So we need to be more specific on this question. That's my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonam. Any other comments or questions? Andy, please.
Yeah, I was following along with that. But from a broad picture, there's sustainability reports and sustainability information, and I think following on with what Sungnam said, just like there are appraisal reports, and assay reports, and valuation reports that don't make it to the public because they're taken by professional accountants and business management accountants who summarize that for public dissemination. I wasn't clear if the sustainability reporting is the sustainability information like carbon emission review or other biochemical or stuff that I don't really know about. So I wasn't sure whether that was a detailed comment or just an overarching comment that just like there's detailed appraisal, valuation, assay, oil and gas exploration stuff that is very important for the ingredients for public reporting about an oil and gas company or an insurance company, it's summarized by the professional accountants. And so the orientation of the information I wanted to make sure is where is that information coming from, the raw information that's not for professional accountants having the expertise. So thank you. I just wanted to follow on. Thank you, Chair, for that opportunity.
Thank you, Andy, for that comment. Caroline, please.
Thanks, Chair. I have a few comments. One is really the timing of these questionnaires. The feedback that we're hearing is that there's been the two EDs and then the SWP survey, and so there's a bit of survey fatigue or fatigue in responding to requests for comments, and I'm just wondering how the working group anticipates these questionnaires going out and the timeline for getting responses, whether it's something that's going to go out or are these questionnaires going to be used as the guidelines for the working group as they engage with various groups of stakeholders. So firstly around how the questionnaires will be disseminated and used. And then secondly, on just broadly on the questions in the questionnaire, I think there's a need to inquire about the extent to which external experts are used or consulted or involved, whether in the production, the preparation, or even the assurance work. And then the other part of it is around independence and the non-assurance services that might or might not be permissible. So earlier on, we talked about the financial statement auditor, whether or not the financial statement auditor can be providing assurance, and just also looking at the extent to which restrictions on non-assurance services would apply to assurance service providers. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Well, we still have a number of requests for intervention. James, what? Oh, sorry. Okay, so I'll just ask you to be as straight to the point as possible because we start being a little bit late, and I'll go around the table. Sadia, please.
I want to echo what Caroline just mentioned. I think that there's a lot of consultations at the moment, and that if you want a good response rate, we're just going to have to time it correctly. So when the questionnaire is released, how long it's being given. I noted that in the questionnaire there were a lot of questions that were not ethical imperatives, and maybe that's one way of a shorter questionnaire that's easier to respond to. Thank you.
Thank you, Satya. Chana.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to echo what Satya said, and then I have a more, I'll send some comments to Sylvia as well, but I have a general comment which sort of goes over different categories. We seem to be asking Mark, who is making the appointment? Is there a reason we are asking that? Because I would have thought that it is the board or those charged with governance who will make the appointment. But it's in all different categories. And I'm sort of wondering, is there a reason we are asking it? Do we know that it's, in some cases, it's the management that is appointing? So just a question.
Thank you, Chana. Mark, if you agree, I suggest that we take all the questions at the same time, okay? Thank you. Vanya, please.
Thank you. Just some comments about who will be in charge of preparing the information, as Sunan asked. IESBA is incorporated integrated reporting, and so integrated reporting established that there must be an end for a silo. So it is not just the accountancy department, not just the human resources, but rather a team of them discussing everything, and that's the main idea.
Thank you, Vanya. Brian?
Thanks. Just further actually to the, I guess, the timing issue, which I'm also hearing just in terms of the amount of content that stakeholders are being asked for responses from IESBA from at this time. But obviously we need this information to proceed. So, I mean, you're in between a rock and a hard place as usual with that. But perhaps one of the things, and I'll send in some detailed comments as well, but a bigger picture comment that impacts not just this questionnaire, but other questionnaires I've seen, and as we move forward to continuing to develop things, a lot of the groups that are being targeted here are really not familiar with our code. And so the language in here is pretty oriented toward an assumption that you're very clear on the code, the fundamental principles, what all the acronyms mean, and so on. And I don't think that that's very accessible. And if I'm a stakeholder like those charged with governance, just randomly out there, or an investor or other users of sustainability reports, which I think are great to hear from, it's a lot of work that we'd be asking them to do to really get familiar with what's going on and then be able to answer some of these questions. And it's really just in the phrasing, but I think some of that can help both with respect to increasing response rates from these different groups that we've historically had a hard time getting a hold of. And then, as has been mentioned by others, really focusing on some of the absolutely key questions that we want responses from folks around. I'm curious too, just generally about the strategy for engaging with some of those different groups directly, again, where there have been challenges in the past with getting these folks to respond to our questionnaires, and not just putting it up on the website, but what can we do about that, and has the group thought about it? Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you very much. Laurie.
Thank you, Chair. So look, I agree with those comments. I think this question of survey exhaustion, I mean, I think it's real and it's out there. And Mark, I think we need to, and I'm on this working group, I think we need to think about how we address that head on the front end, because this is an area, and we've talked about timing and how things are moving. We have, a need for speed and agility here. And the other thing is, I think this is an important part of outreach and listening to those varied groups, not just preparers, but users and those stakeholders that's so important from a public interest standpoint. So I think it's important. And Brian, I was going to make the point that you just made so well said. I think we are going to have to figure out how to activate this to overcome that exhaustion and do some one-on-one direct encouragement and talk to people about how important their view is, because we're going to be using that as a basis to form a lot of what we do. So I think that time will be well spent on the front end, and I think the group can take that away and think about that.
Thank you, Lori. Hero.
Thank you, Gabriela. I have 2 comments on the proposed questions. First, overall, the questions are very simple and broad, but some questions seem to be too simple, and the intentions of the questions may not be clear to respondents. So it might be better to provide some contextual information for some questions for respondents to understand the intentions of the questions. And second, some questions seem to be closely related or overlapped. So I think it may be better to integrate those related questions or overlapped questions into one question. I will send the detailed comment to Sylvia. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiro. I think that there is no one else. James, you're sure that you don't want to come in? So you had.
Yeah, very quickly, and this is on the staff publication. I just wanted to express support. There was a list of practice issues that could lead to greenwashing. I think you've got 8 or so. I would maybe just suggest that as you're positioning the staff publication, which I think is essential to today's environment and to the relevance of the code, just to think whether the practice issues, your specificity, the degree to which you want to go into them. Do you need 8, maybe a few more, a few less? I just wouldn't want to obscure the messaging by bringing in a focus on perhaps either technicalities or specificities. I think it will be a very important messaging and linkage to the code. So just, I see a list of 8 items. Maybe just think about whether you need them all, or you can maybe synthesize a few. And if that assists in us completing that on time, that would be great.
Thank you, James. Lori, should I assume? Okay, thank you very much. Mark, before I try to wrap up, do you want to react?
Okay, so very quickly, absolutely agree, less is more. And given the slightly atypical nature of the audience we might be engaging with, something that is perhaps a shorter, more accessible document might be helpful. On the outreach, I absolutely take the point over survey fatigue. I suppose I look at this as a document that will actually be helpful to us as a working group, and indeed the staff and board members more widely, to help consistent engagement with our stakeholders. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a survey we send out. It's this is your script when you go out to talk to people. And so therefore I think we can overcome that, and it becomes more user friendly in that way. Obviously this is going to be a critical piece of work for us, and we will invest the time to make sure that we get it absolutely right. But I think the points are very helpful in framing that. And I think, you know, the discussion that we've had this morning does go to show that we will need to continue developing the terms of reference and indeed what we propose to do. But that's no bad thing, because it's not going to tie us back and it's not going to restrict us. And we are going to have to keep responding to a very fast developing market. And that's something that I think we understand and appreciate, and are looking forward to doing, and obviously keeping the board updated and drawing on your input and your help. So thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Mark. I agree with that. I was thinking exactly about the same thing, that it is possible that you and the working group will want to look back to the terms of reference in the light of this discussion, but that should not prevent you and us from moving forward with the work, having, of course, this discussion and this proposal at the board, and assuming that the board will be supportive to this approach, and there's no restrictions in respect to it. As to the questionnaire fatigue, it's the word here, and I appreciate that you are aware of that, because it's also one of the comments that we have been receiving from others who are also concerned with that. We know that there are a number of consultations out on the same in the same space, and it's difficult to get in and not to be faced with this fatigue from our stakeholders. What is I think necessary is that on the work that we will undertake on sustainability from now on, and not only, but from now on after this discussion, is that we abide by some principles like of course urgency and speed, but also simplicity, pragmatism, agility, and this questionnaire should also be looked at under this in the light of these principles, making sure that what we are asking in the questionnaire or in bilateral or whatever outreach activities is the information that we really need. And as we can see, we and the working group was able to move forward very quickly without having yet this information. We know already a lot of things. Of course, we cannot take the risk of stating and doing some work on very specific and delicate aspects without having the clear notion of what's behind and without having the necessary information. But I think that we already know a few things, that all these outreach activities have been able to provide us with a very rich and complete information. Thank you, Brian, also for the comment on the language. It seems to be a detail, but it's important because sometimes it's a trap for ourselves, and we don't have the notion that we are speaking a language which not everybody understands, and there is a part of the questionnaire which is dedicated to others, lawyers, etc. So it's important that we take care of that, and the engagement, the reaching out to all the stakeholders. It's also a question, but I'm sure you'll do the best. So, Ken, please. Sorry.
I think we are getting a signal that our break is nigh. Maybe just one final comment from me, Chair, if I may, and that is on the matter of process. The board is clear now, I think, in terms of the direction relative to potential standard setting action. The matter of process really concerns how we will position any standard setting work on sustainability in the context of the current strategy and work plan. The current strategy and work plan was finalized and established back in 2019. So 3 years ago already now. And back then, sustainability wasn't anywhere near the radar screen as we have it today. The SWP, as we have it today, does provide an element of flexibility for the board to pivot and reprioritize work plan items as needed. But in terms of strategic direction, sustainability doesn't quite fit into the current strategy commitments of the board. So there will be a need for the board, and Gabriela, I would say for you to raise this with the PIUB at the July meeting at the earliest opportunity, and really have the support of the PIUB. And I'm really encouraged by the comments from Robert to hear at least from Robert that PIUB supported the direction that the board is traveling. But this is going to be an important issue for this board to have the PIUB full support, so that then IESBA is able to go out to the market and really make that commitment public. And also in your outreach with the likes of the IOSCO and the Monitoring Group and the Financial Stability Board and other important stakeholders.
Thank you very much, Ken. So finally, the working group will take all this discussion into consideration in looking at not only the terms of reference, but also the questionnaire and the strategy as a whole. And we'll come back in September. of course, we cannot always talk between the meetings and have interactions, but we'll come back in September with the terms of reference according to these perspectives, and hopefully with a plan with respect to the strategy, the goals, timelines, etc., for us to approve. Is that it? Sorry? Okay, so you come with a terms of reference, a proposal, and the new code. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to maybe make Mark's point. I think it is important to come back with the terms of reference, but I don't think the decision of finalizing the forms, I think the spirit of the board has come through, and I think to allow the working group as much flexibility as possible to move ahead. And I think if we had to do a formality of the terms of reference, that's great, or clarification of any final points. But again, don't delay our efforts pending that document, as it were. Yeah.
Based on the trust of the board. So thank you very much. I think we will break now for 20 minutes. It was what was previewed. So we will reconvene by well, to be 11:15. I was trying to adjust the time to my time, or my time to your time. 11:15. Thank you, Ken. Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much, you all, for this very productive discussion. Well, thank you very much for being back. We are a little bit late. We are now moving to the next item in the agenda, which is the item of the PI rollout. And we have in the agenda today three objectives. One is that the board receives an update of the rollout activities to raise awareness and promote adoption and implementation of the IESBA revision to the definitions of PI, to provide feedback on the draft IESBA staff PI questions and answers, and to receive an update of the IEESB project on listed entity and PI. Thanking Natalie and sorry, I forgot. Yeah, yes. For joining us for this presentation. Thank you very much. And I'll give the floor to Andy to present.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And yes, and as was mentioned, Natalie and Kalina are IEESB staff who are have an intersection with our project, with the PI project. So I also did want to recognize and acknowledge the members of the working group, which include Rich, Sungnam, Felician, Luigi, and Yaoshu, and we're extremely actively and capably monitored and kept in line by Jeff. So thank you for that. Pointing. Oh, there we go. Okay. Well, I pushed two buttons, but that's okay because you all already had mentioned that what we're going to do is going to give you a brief update on the PI rollout activities. And like the song, we've only just begun. We've only just begun with that. And we're also going to, Sungnam is going to provide an extensive update on where the IAASB is with regard to the transparency requirement, because that was an important part of our coordination and handoff with regard to that. And so Sungnam has agreed to be our correspondent member overseeing the IAASB activities and reporting back to the working group on that. And then when that's finished, I'm going to then come back to our draft Q&As that we published internally, and then to ask for board member input. But in terms of where we are right now with the rollout activities, that is up on the screen. We had a PI webinar on the 24th of May, and Mike Ashley was very kind to come back and participate, our task force chair for the entirety of the PI project. And we had about 250 accounts logged on. Of course, we don't know how many people necessarily were crowded in a room listening to that at a given time, or how many may listen to the recording. But we had an hour webinar where we went through the main points. The upcoming other rollout activities we have is we're going to have an infographic that'll be similar to what you've seen posted by staff on the NAS and the fee project, at least similar in terms of the overall one-page, sort of composition with a mixture of graphics and text. We're going to be producing a series of short videos. We have that in the June to August timeframe. We're hoping maybe Gabriella can provide a first introductory overarching program. The working group will discuss other topics. We're going to try to keep them very short and pointed, with the thought in mind that people will want just a single consumption of a topic. So we might have one on the overall framework, the role of the local bodies, maybe publicly traded entities, and maybe the rest. But the working group will help decide that. Q&A number one, it's listed as number one because we do expect that we'll have to add to that over time. We have the July-August timeframe, but really we've got the draft. It's in the materials. We'll talk about that in a bit. We're going to try to get those published, really as soon as we can, to be thoughtful to address the questions. I mean, the standard itself was published in April in final form. So we're still really on the first several months of having the standard that's been out for the Q&A. And again, thank you in advance for all the input that we've received, for that. An important part of our initial drafting was a PI definitions database that was used, I guess a couple of years ago now, when we started that project, as to what different jurisdictions already define as PIs. And this formed a large part of the task force's decision with regard to the various categories of banks, insurance companies, and then to a lesser extent the collective investment vehicles or the pension entities that were in the initial exposure draft. But an important part of our project right now on the rollout is to identify in a robust fashion what the current database is. And so we'll update that and we'll look forward to where the world stands with regard to the PI definitions around the world. And then we'll thoughtfully look at regional and other local outreaches. And the working groups that I just mentioned is a worldwide working group with that will help us with the various global outreach. And so we'll definitely use them to that extent to be involved with our further outreach. The working groups decided that the initial focus, while we're going somewhat general, will also be to the local bodies, because as you know, this standard has a great deal of refinement by and responsibility by the local bodies. Many of our Q&A deals with that as well. And so we're going to be reaching out to those local groups to help facilitate the implementation and for their further refinement, which the updated PI database will help with that as well. So at this point, you recall that the transparency disclosure that we put in our standard, we had to stay in our lane as the ethical standard setter, and for an auditor, when they described the audit independence, we couldn't go too far as to prescribe or proscribe what an auditor does. That's the lane is for the IAASB. And so Sungnam is now going to take control and explain where the IAASB has been. And he's very generously put his time in to be our correspondent member to track what they've been doing and then to report back to the working group. So Sungnam, take it away.
Thank you, Andy, for your introduction. Today, I have two items to discuss and address, such as transparency disclosure in the auditor's report and practitioner report for review engagement. I will get started with transparency disclosure. In response to revisions to IESBA code in relation to listed entity and PI, IAASB approved its project proposal in March 2022. The project is divided into two tracks with different effective dates. Track 1, which is fast-moving track, deals with the appropriate disclosure mechanism to operationalize paragraph 420, R420 of our PI revisions with an effective date aligned with that of our PI revisions, December 2024. Track 2, which is a separate, will address 3 of the project objectives. As you see on the screen, first, convergence of definitions and concepts between our code and IAASB standards, such as ISQM, ISOs, to the greatest extent. Second, establishment of objective and guidelines with respect to differential requirements for certain entities, such as PIs. Third, determination of differential requirements for listed entities in ISQM and ISOs. The effective date for track 2 will be later than track 1's. At this March meeting, the IAASB discussed 3 options proposed by its PI working group and decided to present its preferred option in the ED and explain the alternative option in the explanatory memorandum, EM. IAASB also decided to ask respondents whether they agreed that the auditor's report is an appropriate mechanism for public disclosure, and if not, to indicate any other mechanisms that should be used. With respect to the difference between the preferred option and alternative option, the preferred option is applied only when the relevant ethical requirements, RER, requires transparency disclosure for PIs as is the case under our PI revisions. On the other hand, the alternative option is applied when differential independence requirements for PIs were applied, irrespective of whether the relevant ethical requirements require transparency disclosure. IESB PI task force has developed the draft ED and EM taking into account its March 2022 IESBA discussions. They'll be presented to the board next week for approval for exposure with a 90-day comment period.
I did that too.
Yeah. Okay, on the next slide, the ED explains the proposed revisions to ISO 700 revised and ISO 260 revised. As to ISO 700 revised, revisions to the requirement in paragraph 28C are proposed to include a new conditional element that applies when RERs require public disclosure that differential independence requirements for audits of financial statements of certain entities were applied. This addition results in a proposed new application material, paragraph A35A, to support the application of the requirement of paragraph 28C with IESBA code as an example. The proposal also includes the revisions to illustrations 1 and 2 in the appendix. With respect to ISA 260 revised, a new application material, paragraph A32A, is proposed to increase transparency with those charged with governance, TCWG. The new application material highlights that the auditor may communicate with TCWG that differential independence requirements for certain entities were applied, and the auditor intends to disclose this information in the auditor's report in accordance with paragraph 28C of ISO 700 revised. As I mentioned before, we need to consider whether the proposed changes in ISO 700 revised operationalize the requirements of paragraph R420 of the PI revisions. With that in mind, let's move to the next slide for the convenience of our discussion. Okay. In paragraph 28C of ISO 700 revised, a new description underlined is added to the extant paragraph. It states that when RERs require the auditor to publicly disclose that differential independence requirements that are applicable only to audits of financial statements of certain entities were applied, the statement shall include that auditor is independent of the entity in accordance with the independence requirement applicable to those entities. Those descriptions are added to the extant paragraph. Okay. The next slide. The proposed application material A35A explains that RER may require the auditor to apply the differential independence requirements applicable only to audits of financial statements of certain entities, and to publicly disclose the fact that those differential independence requirements were applied. The proposed changes include the IESBA code as an example, with an exception to the disclosure requirement in paragraph R421 of our PI revisions. Also, the proposed changes include the illustration of the basis for opinion in the auditor's report as shown on the right-hand side of the slide. This illustration 1 assumes the circumstances that the audit is not a group audit and the auditor complies with IESBA code and jurisdictional ethical requirements. Both of them include differential independence requirements for PIEs and require the transparency disclosure. Reflecting the proposed revisions to paragraph 28C of ISO 700 revised, this illustration of auditor's report states that we conducted our audit in accordance with ISOs, and then we are independent of the company in accordance with IESBA's Code of Ethics, including IIS, as applicable to PIEs, together with ethical requirements for PIEs that are relevant to our audit in jurisdiction. The two phrases underlined were added to the extant wording. This illustration too assumes the circumstances that the audit is a group audit and the auditor complies with the jurisdictional ethical requirements, which include differential independence requirements for PIEs and require transparent disclosure. Okay, this illustration of auditor's report is in line with the previous illustration for the standalone auditor's report. As I mentioned before, the proposed revisions to the auditor's report do not expressly disclose that differential independence requirements for PIE were applied. Nonetheless, the working group has formed the view that the statement indicating that we are independent of the company in accordance with IESBA Code of Ethics as applicable to PIEs is sufficiently clear and operationalizes the public disclosure requirement of paragraph R420 of our PIE revisions. In particular, given that the phrase in accordance with implies that the audit has applied independence requirements for PIEs, thereby enabling the assertion of auditor's independence to be made. Here, I'll pause to hear any comments.
Thank you very much, Sonam. We will now collect comments. Mark.
Thank you. I'm slightly wrestling with some of the language, and it's only because I've been trying to think it through with a sort of UK context, and that is we face a situation where we will have 3 tiers of PIEs. Original PIEs as defined in EU law that we inherited, new PIEs that government intends to create through a completely different mechanism, and new IESBA PIEs following the IESBA, following the change to the code. And we need to ensure that this is as clear as possible to the users of the revised opinion. And I'm thinking of a scenario where you've got audit firms, for instance, operationalizing this requirement, where when they look at their client base, they may choose to say it's easier for us as a firm to just apply the requirements that apply to public interest entities across the board, regardless of what the entity is. And therefore, you'd end up with an auditor's report that was referring to the ethics applicable to public interest entities for entities which may not be public interest entities as defined in law. And therefore, you would need something then to explain the basis for using a requirement that wasn't necessary in that circumstance to avoid creating a false impression with users. Like I'm quite happy to provide some sort of more detailed comments offline, but that's what worries me. It's just that, and it was always going to be a challenging issue to roll out the revised PIE definition across so many jurisdictions. And I think some great work has been done to get there. But I think it needs some careful thought to ensure that we don't create the wrong impression for the user of the amended auditor's report about what's actually applied in these circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I think that Andy wants to react.
Yeah, no, those are very relevant comments. The PI standard does refer to when entities that are not otherwise part of the PI listing are treated as PIs. There's that's reserved for only when all other aspects of being treated as a PI are in fact applied, you know, which include the full line of the NAS and the fees, and also whether or not the public accountant believes that the PA believes, personal accountant believes that there's a structure of governance in place. So I think those comments might transcend what we're being asked right now. So and certainly to the extent that members have views that are different as to what the IAASB should issue as their standard, then the appropriate form is for, you know, comments being provided to the IAASB. At this point, the task force just wanted to make the working group wanted to make sure that as we're monitoring the work of the IAASB, did they tick the box for the R420 that we sent to them? Because theoretically that could be existing right now without having any IAASB work being done. But you know, we were limited to being able to reach into the auditor's report because that isn't our lane to be. So, I mean, I think your comments, Mark, are very interesting and do present an actual real practical problem. But I'm not sure, I'm just taking them on board if it's a comment for our working group and correspondent member or a comment for the IAASB. But it does sound like it's a worthwhile comment for some combination of all of that. So right now, the working group cannot, we're observers of the IAASB project, and we want to make sure that we are satisfied and you're satisfied as a board that the IAASB has ticked the box for the requirement that we have in our code. So thank you for those comments.
Thank you very much, Andy. Geoff.
Thanks, Gabrielle, and thanks, Andy. And thanks, Mark, as well. Just on that, just to add to what Andy has said, I'll draw the board's attention to the proposed A35A application material. It already mentions about if firms want to voluntarily add entities as PI. So that's sort of covered in the application material. So that hopefully that should be, you know, abundantly clear. That firms might treat entities as PIs in addition to those categories that are listed out in our PI revisions in the provisions as those mandatory categories.
Thank you, Geoff. Okay.
Thank you, Gabrielle. I'm just trying to understand Mark's question and whether that question relates to what Geoff has just said. Mark, and maybe you can clarify, was your concern more in relation to the discretion the auditor might have to treat certain entities as PIs versus those entities that would be considered PIs as defined by law or regulation? Because our broad definition under the revised PI definition does take into consideration entities that would be defined as PIs by local law regulation.
So I think if I step back from it, Ken, in response to the question that the working group particularly asked us, I think the new application material as A35 is helpful, but specifically the wording in the basis for opinion that's included within A35 where it just says as in 3 lines from the bottom, as applicable to public interest entities, that's where the risk of confusion lies to me if an auditor chooses to voluntarily adopt requirements that they're not required to adopt. So I think the application material itself is helpful, but I think the wording in the basis for opinion that's included in A35 is where it runs the risk of confusion, which then makes me say, is it successful in discharging the obligation in the code over transparency? I think it will be 9 times out of 10, but there's a risk that 1 in every 10 times it doesn't.
Could I ask, are you suggesting that if a auditor voluntarily applies PI and does so, with all the bells and whistles, that the transparency requirement should differentiate between the voluntary PIs and the compulsory PIs?
So I just think it would be helpful if they explained why they'd done that, just from the perspective of the user, looking at something that was not required by law or regulation, or for instance, because the code required it with a revised definition. But if they've chosen to voluntarily apply it, should they explain why, so the user understands that and it's entirely transparent, rather than just leaving this reference in, which I think, as I say, in 90% of times, it will satisfy the code's transparency requirements. It just raises a question for me whether there's a risk in that minority of cases that it doesn't.
Is it clear, Andy?
I do understand. I need to take that on board as to whether or not our existing standard that we've already published, whether there's any I don't think there's a requirement for it. So I think it does. I think the board did not differentiate between entities that are treated as PIs because of a voluntary aspect or entities that are treated as PIs because of a compulsory aspect. And so therefore, I don't think the transparency requirement contemplates differential in the extant standard. So I think it might be beyond, my initial reaction is it might be beyond the scope of the IESB project and our extant PI revision, for that. But maybe I just need to think about that some more.
Great. Geoff, please.
Sorry, I was just going to agree with Andy that I think, Mark, what you suggested is a great idea, but it's not required by the code. So I'm not sure if the board can, we can go back with that comment, but again, I think it's ultimately up to IESB to take that as a comment at this point.
Okay, thank you. Caroline, please.
Thanks, Chair. So I just wanted to respond to this point. And when we discussed the PI definition, there were concerns that if you had a company that was going for listing, and so it's potentially disclosing confidential plans, future plans of the entity. And I think if you take that into consideration, we wouldn't want to disclose the reason why they're treated as a PI. So just trying to bring the board back to what had been discussed previously on confidentiality. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Ken, please.
Yeah, I think it's useful to maybe just kind of rewind the tape a bit to just bring back a bit of the context of the board's discussion on the issue of the transparency requirement, and really a large part of the motivation behind the transparency requirement was to bring an element of market discipline as to how firms would choose under the code's provisions, and the code does allow that flexibility, if you will, for firms to identify certain entities, and these would be, I would say, more on the rare side of things. If they were to choose to identify certain audit clients as PIs, even though not defined as PIs per se by law or regulation, that there will be transparency as to which independence requirements have been applied in those particular circumstances. In other words, if the firms would have chosen to go ahead and apply the PI requirements to those entities, even though those entities are not classified as PIs. And if that were the case, that there be transparency under the code as to which independence requirements have been applied. So the board has concluded on this issue. It's not for the board to reopen the question as to whether or not there should be a transparency requirement. That requirement is in the final provisions, and what is on the table now is for discussion as to whether what the IESBA is proposing adequately or effectively operationalizes that requirement in the code. So I just want to be clear that this requirement for transparency in the code is not for redebating. The board has committed to undertaking in due course a post-implementation review exercise to understand how the market has adopted and implemented those revised provisions. And it may be that as part of that exercise, we will understand how the market has adopted and in fact operationalized the requirement and applied it. So I would suggest that that ought to be how we would travel the discussion, but that we don't actually redebate the transparency requirement because the board has debated it at length in finalizing the PI provisions.
So if I may, it's the board already decided which independent standards were applied, not why the practitioner got to that. And you're raising as Jeff said, maybe a very interesting point, but I think the standard we're dealing with is the which, not the why. So, but thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Ken, for this background information, which is also important also to Jeff. I don't know if there is any other comment at this. Oh, sorry, Galen.
Yeah, I really appreciate, Ken, your insight on this. And I think that's why I felt way back when we were discussing this, that it was the obligation of the entity to describe what they are, as opposed to the implication that the auditor has made that determination. I think Mark has raised a very salient point here, and I've seen this in practice, not on this particular issue, but where firms do adopt the most strenuous, the highest bar for all of their practice, just to keep things simple. And I think this is going to cause a certain amount of confusion. I wish it could be avoided. I don't know how to do it at this point.
Thank you, Galen. So, there are any other comments? I don't know if Andy or any of you want to react. If not, I think we can move forward. Ken, do you want to?
Yeah, Gabriel, I think unless there are any concerns or objections as to what IESBA has proposed, Chair, I think the conclusion then is that the board is supportive of the proposal that the IESBA has put forward. Just to be clear.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Ken. Possibly providing them with the feedback of the board with respect to the discussion that was held here, just for informative purposes, but without any concerns regarding the project. So thank you. Thank you very much. And I think that I'll give the floor back to you for the next part of the PI rollout project. Thank you.
Okay, the next is about disclosure in practitioner's report for review engagements. As you know, under the code, the transparency requirement is also applied to review engagements. Focus of our discussions around enhancing transparency has been put on audit engagements rather than review engagements. As we recall, at our March meeting, IESBA staff provide an update on its proposals in relation to review engagements. We are supportive of the following two proposals. First, IWSB will seek feedback about whether it should consider revisions to ISRE 2400 revised to address the transparency requirements for review engagements. In this regard, paragraph 86J of ISRE 2400 revised requires the practitioner's report to include a reference to the practitioner's obligation under that IESRE to comply with relevant ethical requirements. However, the practitioner is not required to provide a statement similar to that required by paragraph 28C of ISO 700 revised, nor do they need to identify the jurisdiction of origin of the relevant ethical requirements or report to the code. Second, IWSB proposed that it will revise ISRE 2410 as part of its PI project. As such, the proposed EM explains the IWSB's approach to addressing transparency requirements for review engagements and include a question pursuant to its proposals. Further, at the meeting, we are supportive of a suggestion raised at the meeting in March to include a question in the EM about whether there are any jurisdictions that require the review report to include a statement that the practitioner is independent of the company in accordance with the independence requirements relating to review engagements. A brief explanation is provided in the EM, and a related question was formulated in collaboration with our staff. This is the question included in the ED. Our PI working group was supportive of this proposed question as a way for the IESBA to obtain the relevant information. As I mentioned before, it will also help us assess if any further action is required. Okay, I'll pause here.
Thank you very much, Sonam. And now we can listen to your reactions to this question. China, please.
So Sonam, in response to your question, in Australia, we require that. So the Australian version of ASRE 2410 makes them say that they are independent in accordance with the Corporations Act and APS 110, which is the Australian version of the IESBA code, and also that as relevant to the annual financial report. So the review report links, because it's for the auditor of the entity. So it's already in the, you can, in the ASRE 2410, the model reports already have it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chana. Sadia.
When we first received feedback on this item at the last meeting, I was surprised because I wondered whether, when we set the requirement for transparency, whether annual transparency on whether an entity is a PI was sufficient. Because if we're saying that an entity is a PI, we would expect that it stays a PI for at least a year. And if you're getting that kind of feedback in the audit report, would the review report be a duplication of something that's already available in the public? With that in mind, I think that the question is sufficient. And I hope that the feedback comes more in favor of how my jurisdiction sees it rather than the way Australia is currently seeing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadia. Anyone else wants to come in? Well, I don't see anyone. So back to you.
Are you through, Sonam, with the update? Yes, thank you, thank you for that, and for tracking the IASB work on that. Much appreciated. Okay, next, the last thing we had on our objective was the draft Q&As. And before I discuss the draft Q&As, I want to express that the last time I talked to you about we're going to have a draft Q&As in March, I was skeptical as to how quickly we could pull this document together. So I do want to make sure I thank very much Jeff for his outstanding work at pulling it together, and the working group who provided absolute invaluable input into the questions and the proposed answers. So that's I wasn't sure we'd get a document, let alone a 10+ page document. So I think it's a very useful document in the public interest to help answer some questions about our new standard. So in developing this draft, we considered the supplementary guidance that was during the drafting process of the standard. We did specifically get preliminary input from various groups who helped us. And we considered questions from the PI webinar that we just held. And many of the questions really were already consistent with what we had in our draft Q&As. The focus is somewhat on assisting local bodies with adoption. The definition of the publicly traded entity is one that has a lot of interest, and the working group does plan to have additional outreach to assist in addressing specific issues. The transparency requirement that we just discussed is also part of the Q&As, and so the next steps, subject to the board approval, is to release these as soon as we thoughtfully can. It was certainly no later than the July or August timeframe, and we'll consider the need to whether to have another round of questions as we continue along with that. So I think we didn't want to wait to have every question and every answer before we get useful information out to our constituency. So rather, we didn't want perfection to be the enemy of progress. So the document is terrific. It's got a lot of questions. There could be more questions. Having said that, the working group will take on board the board's view of any questions that are missing, any answers you feel inaccurate. Keep in mind that we can answer questions based upon the board's deliberations and public process. We can't interpret the document or issue any sort of interpretation. And sometimes that's a fine line, but we believe that the answers are grounded in the basis for conclusion or in other publications of the board. Certainly, if anyone believes that we have overreached an answer, we certainly want to hear that as well. And I'm not at all meaning to limit what happens right now, but we don't need, I'm sure we don't want this to be a drafting phase of the various questions and answers. We'll be happy to take offline any particular editorial comments that anyone wants to make with regard to our draft questions or our draft answers. But to the extent that the board wishes to provide input on the matters I just mentioned, this is the time to do that, please.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you to the group and Geoff for the relevant work done here. It's impressive how you progressed since March in these frequently asked questions. And I must confess that myself, I read it with pleasure, because having not been involved in the previous phase of the project, it brings very clear the importance not only of the project, but the importance of clarifying some aspects to make this rollout be successful and to help jurisdictions implementing the stand. So thank you very much. Yes, we will collect some comments as long as you have it, without preventing the board members to, as Andy was saying, to establish one-on-one bilateral communications on some more detailed comments that you may have, so that you can allow the working group to progress. Starting with Mark.
Thank you. Yes, I agree that the paper is very helpful. I've got two sort of comments make, and anything else I'll take offline. The first is in respect of question 1. There's a reference in there that says the public interest focus for the purposes of independence should be on the general financial health of an entity as reflected in the entity's financial statements, rather than the technical terminology or compliance with technical pronouncements, which is the focus of the auditors. I don't think that which is the focus of the auditors is helpful, because that's actually overly narrow, I think, because I think we'd be thinking it's much more about technical compliance with standards, but also compliance with the framework of law and regulations more widely. So if perhaps there's an opportunity to consider that. And then in question 2, I think there's some very helpful text in question 2 as to why ESG matters may not cause an entity to be a PIE. But as a result, the document is screaming out for something that goes the opposite way and actually says why ESG factors could cause an entity to be considered a PIE. And then I think it would make that even stronger and more helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Brian.
Thanks. Yeah, and I certainly agree that the document is overall super helpful. I've got some just concerns around some of the examples, and some of them with respect to just the wording of the example, and some around kind of jurisdictional issues that you might want to think about changing. So in question 2, example 2 on the social media provider example, I'd consider a different back end to that example, because although the statement that's being made there might be true in some countries, and over the longer term, the reliance on some of these platforms such as Facebook for communications and actually e-commerce infrastructure in countries like India, Mexico, and Brazil, and the small business and the informal economies is quite notable. And I think you don't have to go past the 6-hour Facebook outage late last year to recognize a very poignant and well-documented example of that. So I'm not suggesting any change with respect to the front end, but just in terms of the rationale being provided for that, I don't think that would fit with kind of the fact pattern that some countries certainly are experiencing. On question 3 and the second factor, I'll start there. Again, the last paragraph there, if an entity is subject to regulatory supervision, that seems to conflict with factor 1. And I'm speaking from my jurisdiction, probably others as well, though, where in factor 1, there's a comment, public sector services are less likely to attract, and yet those are highly regulated areas. And so there's kind of a push-pull situation happening there. Same with the potential conflict with factor 4. The example being provided is an electrical utility, and they're being unlikely to create significant disruption if a utility were to fail. And I thought that was problematic, and also just the way that that's being described. Typically, utilities are natural monopolies, and so if there's a failure there, there's a problem, right? Because they're built around transmission, distribution, generation of power, and so that might be a concern as well. And then just on factor 5, the last sentence, a relevant local body might determine such entities should be treated as PIEs. I was just wondering if there might be a little more specificity there, who we might mean. Are we getting to regulatory body, professional body, like what might do that? And I know you're trying to be a little bit generic by necessity because it has to apply across jurisdiction. But when we're talking about private companies and large numbers of employees, I'm wondering about the pragmatic implementation of that. And it just sounds like, how would that work? I guess a little bit more of an example in that area would be helpful. But yeah, like I said, those are my only points. That otherwise I thought the document was great. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Hiro.
Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you, Andy. I have a comment in relation to publicly traded entities. According to the basis for conclusions for the PIE provisions, exchange traded funds seem to be categorized into publicly traded entities. but exchange traded funds don't have a corporate governance arrangement. So what is not clear here is whether the NAS provisions or fee-related provisions are applied to exchange traded funds. In particular, whether and how the TCWG related provisions are applied to exchange traded funds. I think it would be necessary to provide any guidance on this issue, but I'm not sure whether this Q&A is an appropriate place for such a guidance. And in addition, in relation to paragraph 418A2, if a local body decides to add CIVs as an additional pie category, a similar guidance would be necessary too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiro. Well, Andy, do you want to provide any reaction to these comments?
The reaction is to thank you, and I've made notes on the comments. I think for efficiency of our time, I think I'll say that the working group will be meeting later today, and we can take these comments on board. And I appreciate the detailed input with regard to the factors and your comments about the ESG calling out for public interest is part of the issue in our standard is financial failure of the entity and the systemic effect on the local economy and whether or not it could be replaced by someone else, which gets into the utility aspect that you mentioned too. So I guess it might. Not all utilities are necessarily of the same flavor in a location where there's no replacement versus one where there are. The systemic impact would, I'm sure, be much more draconian. So I think we need to we'll take that on board to make sure our answers are thoughtful and don't lead all readers. You know, the problem with questions is sometimes the reader of the question will pigeonhole their facts into the question when it's not really appropriate to do so. And especially in the utility space, we may need to be more careful that we describe the situation we're thinking of, as opposed to it could just be any situation for utility. So, I mean, Jeff, do you have any other reactions to it other than say we'll take them? I've made notes and we'll take them on board this afternoon.
Thanks, Andy. Definitely. Just Brian, your point about the utilities, I think we'll make those examples a bit clearer. But the point that was made a couple of times in the board discussions during the PI project is it's not so much the utility company, because there are many aspects to the supply of these sort of essential services. I think the point was more about a front end company selling you utilities that could be if that that went down, there'll be another company that sells you the same services. I think that's the point. But we'll make those points clearer. But like what Andy has said, the working group definitely take those comments on board. But see Ken's hands up and Chana as well.
Thank you. Chana?
Thanks, Chair. I have a couple of comments. The first is in example 1. I wonder when you say major charity that runs programs, whether you add nationally or internationally. So we are talking about a Red Cross or a World Vision type, large charity rather than a small one. So that would make a clear distinction. Then in respect to the public utility, I got the same reaction that Brian got. With the public utility, the term public utility is generally used for the distribution business, the poles and wires, right? So it's not for the generation of energy or the retailing part. Public utility is used for the poles and wires. And I think if you lose that word there, then it works well, because later on you say a pie could be a public utility, right? So I think all you have to do is to lose the term public utility in that example.
Lose? Did you say lose or use?
No, lose.
Okay, lose. Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Chana. Ken.
I just wanted to come back to Hiro's comment on, I think, your first point. You raised a question as to whether exchange, in the context of the definition of public interest, not the public interest, but publicly traded entity, whether that would scope in exchange traded funds. And I sort of heard you saying that there's a reference to this in the basis of conclusions. And I just had a quick search and I couldn't find it. So I'm just a bit intrigued, but I had a quick reaction in the sense that when I think about exchange traded funds, I thought more about the concept of a collective investment vehicle. And maybe that's an issue that we could consider in the context of this other pre-commitment that the board has made to look at the topic or the area of collective investment vehicles and deal with all the associated independence questions around those vehicles. So that's more for the working group to kind of take on board. But I didn't immediately think that we needed to address the question necessary in the FAQs, other than to just bear that in mind as we look at this other project of collective investment vehicles.
Thank you, Ken. Andy, any comment?
I think we will take that on board because it is a intriguing question, because something can fit more than one category at the same time. So it could be a publicly traded entity and also be a collective investment vehicle in a manner of speaking. And I think if it trips one, it's a pie. So I think we need to be careful to explain what we're meaning. So we'll look at the exchange traded fund example. Thank you.
Right. Caroline, please.
Thanks, Chair. Just going to this exchange traded fund, and I mean, in Singapore, we have real estate investment trusts and business trusts, and those legally are not considered entities. So it is creating a bit of a dilemma for us, because they are publicly traded, they are listed, but they're not entities. And so I think if there is an FAQ on it, it would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Robert? Robert?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I thought it would be helpful just to seek the floor on this item briefly, because the PIOB has been working closely with the board on this project, and also encouraging the interaction between the two boards to ensure an aligned approach. And so that was a great discussion earlier on. Thank you very much for that. It's great to see the corresponding member approach working in practice, which is very good and very much serving the public interest. So thank you for that. The good discussion on the questionnaire just now, and I'm not going to comment on the detail of the questions, obviously, but it's certainly useful, isn't it, to test the components of the new definition, especially around financial condition, and some of those examples that have just been discussed recently and just in the last few minutes have been very helpful. So it will be most useful to proceed with the questionnaire and get that input. We certainly think agreeing with the focus on the local bodies in getting the reactions and providing a forum. I think the paper says to national standard setters to share views on their challenges and learnings so far, in taking up particularly the top-down, bottom-up approach as it was developed and as it's now known with the pension funds and the collective investment vehicles. So that's very good. But I did just have a question, if I may, Chair, to Andy, about just the timing of that. So it looks as if the holistic review that's referred to is going to commence in 2023. Can you just explain how that's going to work with the other interaction that you're proposing with the national standard setters? because obviously it's that holistic review was an important element of the follow-up to the approval of the definition. And just as a closing comment, it's very pleasing, obviously, with the discussion we've just had earlier today, that there's an emphasis on the sustainability reporting developments as well. So well done for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Robert. Andy, there is a question for you.
Yes, certainly. No, thank you. And the holistic review and the path forward with regard to the other categories that are in compulsory categories is part of that process. And I think we will start that process not in 2023, but in this year, when we're reaching out to local bodies for their refinement purposes. And we will start the conversation of it's not just refinement, but that the standard also has the additional guidance with regard to other categories as well. So I think I'll just answer that to Robert from a general perspective, that we're going to try to couple it up with the rollout for the local bodies, both for their refinement on the existing compulsory categories, but also for the more forward-looking categories after we've completed or as we complete at the same time the survey of the definition of pies around the world. But it is something that the working group wants to definitely make sure that we give that adequate consideration, because that is really part of the project. And so it's rolling out not just the compliance with the mandatory categories, but also with the spirit of the additional categories as well. So I think for now, I'll beg to discuss that on an overarching perspective, and the particular plans and the procedures and the way forward will be worked out with the working group as we progress through 2022. Hopefully at least that touches upon what you are directing towards me.
Absolutely. Thank you for the answer. That's great. Thank you.
With that concludes the working group report. So thank you for your attention. And again, I will invite all board members and others to direct us to any particular comments you have on the editorial on the Q&As, because our intention is just to try to get out this first batch of Q&As with haste, but also not recklessness. So we want to make sure that we have appropriate and thoughtful answers, because we don't want to withdraw any of our answers after we've issued them. So again, appreciate everyone's input. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Unless there is any other comment, I would stop here with this item, thanking the working group and the chair of the working group, the task force, for the excellent work done. This is a very important project, as we know. And also, I'd like to thank the IESBA for the coordination with us, and for the excellent coordination and work together, which is important to make sure that the follow-up of these new provisions be successful. So following up on this discussion, the board will bring this feedback, the feedback from the board, to the IESBA for consideration, and we'll work on the adjustment as necessary of the frequently asked questions in the light of the feedback received, and in the light of possible other comments that can be provided to the working group. Is that fine? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we would now move to the next topic in the agenda, with a presentation from IFAC on the educational side. Sorry. We welcome Ellen Partridge, the IFAC director, who will give us an update on the activities of the IFAC panel on accountancy education, which is of relevance to IESBA. Thank you very much for joining us and for providing us with this update. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity for being here. So at this time of year, as you can imagine, it's education time. Grades are being submitted. Normally, I would bring an IPAE member with me, but they're all tied up trying to do markings and graduations and things. So I do apologize, you're stuck with me for today. And with forgiveness, I'm actually going to broaden it just a little bit from just what the IPAE does to the full remit of accounting education. IPAE is the advisory group that I support, but we are doing a lot more. There's a lot more actually stakeholders that I work with. But I will get to the IESBA IPA liaison relationship, which has been a wonderful, wonderful tool for us to be using. So on the next slide, you'll see, as I mentioned, the IFAC accounting education, it's a huge remit. All our initiatives really fall under 3 different buckets. We have a set of standards, the international education standards, that are still there. They are still being supported. We still do adoption and implementation. They've not been very active since the work of the Education Standards Board concluded, but they do still exist, and they are still foundational to many, many PAOs, actually all PAOs, and to the extent that even some jurisdictions have it in their legislation. We have stakeholder engagement. So this is working with PAO education directors, firm directors, academics, students, again, a huge array of individuals we work with. And then advocating or thought leadership. I call this challenging the profession. Think about where you can take your skills and your competencies and where can you take them in new areas, right? I'm very concerned that the profession is declining because we're thought of as bookkeepers and tax accountants, all that boring stuff, right? But we are capable of so much. Sorry, I hate taxes. I apologize. I'm an auditor by trade and preparer. Taxes are just not my forte. But that is how we are thought of by many, many students. And so I need to find a way to tap that potential and say, you should be doing data analytics, you should be doing technology, sustainability, that value, the mission-driven desire that I think our future generation has. So I call it challenging the profession because I need to make them understand we need to advocate for ourselves, right? We need to be talking outside of the profession to do that. So I know I've got Q&A at the end, but because of the breadth of the remit, if you have questions along the way, please stop me. In terms of the standards, I mentioned earlier that we haven't been very active. This year is the first year we actually are considering revisions potentially for sustainability and also for the impact of the technological advancements on assessments. You think about what COVID's done. It's forced us all back into our home. I'm seeing remote invigilation, online assessments. I think one of the institutions had to literally send an invigilator to every home for the student that was taking the assessment to watch that it was being done securely and appropriately. To me, that's crazy. But we've got to figure out how to help the PAOs advance in that area. Sustainability, and I'll explain a little bit later, but my thought is we have some of those foundations. We have many foundational skills and competencies, but at the same time, I can't be seen to not do anything. Right? I think if we're seen to not be considering sustainability in the education standards, then we're going to be considered complacent. So there is some level of work being done for the standards. I'm just not entirely sure where it's going to head at this point. At the same time, we're also working with the adoption and implementation. If you've looked at the global map recently, we are one of the lowest adopted standards and implemented standards. And it's because there are so many challenges and barriers to overcome it. We've been piloting a kind of a session initiative in the Middle East, North Africa region, where we've gone to every PAO to help us understand what those barriers were, and where can we maybe leverage some of our initiatives to be able to advance their own work. We've actually found 2 PAOs just by having the conversation that they said, well, we've done all that. We said, so why aren't you fully adopted? You tell us. So it's just a misunderstanding. We've actually found 2 PAOs that have adopted the standards by that conversation. But at the same time, there's also this strong desire just to talk and to work together and collaborate within the PAOs that will allow for some of the Arabic translations to be extended further. The other model that we're dealing with is an instance where the PAO doesn't control the education in the universities. So the PAO is responsible for the assessment, but the ministers of the finance or education are often the ones driving university curricula. I know it's very prevalent in Latin America as well. And so you'll see on the last point here, we're having a session in 2 weeks in the Middle East, North Africa, where we've convened educators, governmental bodies, and PAOs with the goal of having a call for action that says, you guys need to come together, because we're hearing from the PAOs, you're not training students to be able to pass the assessment. You need to think about the education standards, because that's what the assessments are driven by as you're bringing students through the curricula. So far, we have 600 people registered. I'm like super excited that there's so much traction in that one region, that when we start thinking about taking this globally, it's my hope is tremendous. With respect to stakeholders, and so this is the IPAE is again my strongest advisory group, 22 individuals, a very diverse group of and vocal group of individuals made up of academics, PAOs, educators, education directors of firms, as well as professional accountants in business. And we've gone to 6 meetings for 2 hours every year just to try and get as much knowledge as we can out of them. And I also got time zones that go from the West Coast Australia. So you're never going to find a good time zone for everybody. So the shorter meetings seems to work a bit better. We also do these things with conversations with experts. And this is something where we have individuals invited who are experts in their fields, whether it's anti-money laundering and bribery, technology, but they come and talk about what they've done so that my panel can think about how does that impact education. The one we've got coming up in next week, I think it is around the technician bodies, which is something that's not highly aware, like we're not highly aware of it, but they're professional accountants in their own right. And so thinking about how they implement, they're influenced by the education standards is key. As I said, I've got a very active group of volunteers, which I'm fortunate of because I am the only person in education at IFAC. I have 1 EA and I have 1 intern finally for the summer. But so having a strong, active group of volunteers is key to me getting as much done as I can. So we have 5 innovation teams that have been stood up from the panel. 1 is on ESG. I've got 1 on the future of learning, public sector. And then we've got 1 on standard setting board collaboration, which I probably should change to coordination because I know collaboration is a nifty word right now. But this is where the IPAE IESBA liaison relationship has really cemented itself. It's Vanya, Deanne, and Cam. Thankful that they've come with open-mindedness as to how we can leverage the work of both bodies. It's not about finding new things. There's too much to do as it is. But how can we leverage the work that we're currently doing so that 1 + 1 = 3? How can we highlight and elevate that impact? The second column here is the education directors of PAOs and firms. This is the individuals who have to implement the standards that we put out. And so I leverage them frequently. Once a year, we come together to talk about where we think there might be needed revisions to the standards so that we can then take that throughout the year. This year also, again, because there's that strong desire to have a conversation, to talk about where there's been highlights, where success stories. So we've got 4 virtual knowledge sharing sessions throughout the year now. And they're going very well, which I'm excited about. And in the third column here, I've got other key accounting stakeholders. So originally when Alta set this up, because I'm the successor to Alta and big shoes to fill, holy moly. But she had intended to have this key accounting stakeholders meeting around council. But when COVID hit, she expanded it even further and took it to a virtual summit. Bring together experts again in their field to present globally, that then the education directors, the IPAE, can think about and reflect upon what the messages were. So I've continued that summit. Last year it was on sustainability, this year it's on technology, and there is an invitation for the ethics board to have join a panel at the summit. The other 2 stakeholder groups I've got up here, and I'm still figuring out how to crack the nut on them, is the academics and the students. Right? People who we haven't naturally thought about going to, but are so heavily influenced by what we do. So we're working on that. The MENA Regional Conference, again, is the one that I'm excited is progressing the academic engagement. Thought leadership and advocacy. So we've aligned on 5 areas. And for some of you who may recognize, these were the initial 5 impact areas that IFAC was considering early in the year. They really resonated with the panel such that we kept them. Because what I found was that the innovation teams, these subset teams, were standing up along these topics. And this is more transient, right? This is more knowledge-based. I can see these evolving throughout time. But talking through some of these key areas, you've got advancing sustainability, right? I mentioned earlier, I believe and we believe that the skills and competencies of the professional accountant are really best positioned to take us into sustainability. So what we've been doing is mapping it was the competency framework for the SASB at the time, and we're trying to get in front of the IESBA as well, to the education standards. So if you've got the competencies to meet the SASB FSA credential, and you have the IESs, then to me, that's a natural fit. There is nuances, right? I get, materiality, the concept of materiality, the topic. It's a hot topic, but we know what materiality is. We know what is relevant to the user, right? We may debate what materiality might be, but not everyone knows that. So that's the skills and competencies, but there is still a need for knowledge acquisition. Right? There is a need to understand carbon emissions. And this is where we are pushing further for collaboration amongst the education directors in twofold. One is, can we get case studies in the hands of academics so they can build it into their existing curricula? Two is there existing publicly available courses or credentials that a professional accountant associated or as a member of a small PAO can go to and get? ACCA, AICPA, they all have courses, they all have credentials that are readily available. So getting that in the hands of all professional accountants. In technology, to me, the key here is helping professional accountants see themselves, right? See themselves doing the data analyst work. And if anyone's seen the World Economic Forum and report from, I think it's the jobs report from last year, you'll see auditing, bookkeeping is a declining profession, but data analysts, data scientists are all advancing professions. You go deeper into the skills and competencies, and the ICT skills that we put in 19 now, they all feed into these new advancing areas. We need to help the profession see that. Right? We need to help them. I've also got the Future of Learning Innovation team is trying to figure out how do we inspire or encourage the mid-season career professional to gain these skills. They're the ones that are struggling. The students are getting it, right? The retirees don't need it. But that mid-season who we don't have necessarily CPD specific requirements. It's national, it's jurisdictional based. So how do we encourage them to go and find these skills? Ensuring quality and integrity. I mentioned the MENA conference, and I'll come back to the specific initiatives we've done with the Ethics Board. Public sector, I've got one individual on the panel who's extremely passionate about public sector. And there's just a real need. To me, again, I think there's the future generations want that value, the mission and the purposeful work. And I see public sector being a draw to attract more people to the profession. So we're figuring out how do we get some of these public sector case studies and examples, again, into curricula, going to universities and helping them advance. And then the safeguarding and a resilient and valued profession. Again, this is how do we get more people? It's not about cutting each other's members. It's about growing the professional from 3.5 million to 6-7 million by saying, what is it we are capable of doing? So moving to the the IESBA IPA liaison contributions. So when I first came in December of 20 at this point, 20, Diane says, I started this with Alta, let's keep going. Fine, I love it. And then I met Vanya, and I knew Cam from 3 past lives, I think it is. But the open-mindedness that we've come together, we've already completed 4 different items in the past year that it's been a kind of a cross-collaboration, cross-contribution. The professional skepticism, inquiring mindset work that all the boards were doing at one point, we put out an article that connected the dots. Like, think about the different audiences and what do they mean, so you're not confused by what the definition are. Deanne gratefully asked me to lead a panel, Global Ethics Day, which was so much fun. We've contributed, I think, to Brian's your series of papers, and then you came and did outreach. So there's already been a tremendous amount of coordination, and I think it's only going to keep building. So the future possible initiatives, I'm not promising anything, there's always possibilities. But one is the sustainability. How do we overcome this crisis of confidence? How do we encourage people to really move into this area? And I put up my little formula here. And I mentioned skills and competencies plus knowledge, right? But it's all positioned on a foundation of integrity and ethics that we're known for. So if we're known for the skills, we're known for the integrity and the trust, the ethics, people trust us to, right, assure things, then new knowledge, which is nothing new to us. We've always got lifelong learning. We've always learned something new industries, new transactions. We know how to find that knowledge. That's what will allow us to move into the area, into new areas, including sustainability. Looking for something on Global Ethics Day. What can we do to help advance the ethics and the code, as well as the education standards? I'm hoping we might eventually get an educational development wrapper around the 4-part series that Brian had produced. I mentioned the panel on ethics and corruption. I think there's a possibility here of overlaying the work of the Ethics Board, as well as the IFAC initiative on anti-money laundering and bribery, to really kind of bring that to light. And the last one here, I've got fraud and bribery war stories. So we're going to try and take on some real life cases from like the legal documents and put together what are the skills and competencies that you might want to think about when you're faced with something similar. Where's the code references, possibly even where the audit references are. What audit standards might you go through? It's fun. We've been doing FIFA, we've been doing Petit Valerie. It's been fun. We'll see how far we get with it, but that's a good one. So I'll stop there. I know I've thrown a lot at you, but is there any other areas of possible coordination between the work of ethics and IFAC county education? Or Vanya, I'm not sure, Diane, if you have any other thoughts at this point.
I'd like to thank Helen for being here, sharing with us the work of the education panel. I must say that one of the biggest gifts that I was given when I entered this board was to be part of this panel, because I've been learning quite a lot. You have already realized that Helen is so inspiring and positive, and thank God we have Diane there to keep our feet on the ground, because we dream quite a lot in our discussions. And I'd also like to thank Diane for making room for this presentation, because I think that it is so important for us to share what's happening. And Helen told about the future of our profession. We need to learn from the past. We need to have an eye on the present, and we need to build the future. And I think that education is essential for all those dimensions. And so the closer we are able to work, it makes so much sense in my view, because we are here to build trust. And trust is not something that we just get there adding 2 + 2. So we need to have some values like ethical behavior in the future professionals in our area. And so I'd like to thank for these close to 2 years or very good moments together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you very much, Vanya. It's a pleasure indeed to see how passionate you are about this subject, and it is indeed important for IESBA. We are in the business of developing standards, but we need you to leverage on the standards to prepare the grounds for people to understand the standards and to educate not only the younger generations, but also, and to give them the right perspective and understanding of what the profession does and what's the purpose. As you were saying, the younger generations look for a purpose, for working for the good of the people, etc. Public sector and interest for the public sector shows that. So this liaison, this collaboration between IESBA and IFAC, and the kind work that IFAC and you, in particular, have been performing in this direction is extremely important for us. So thank you, Helen, and thank you, Vanya and Jan. And Cam. And now we have some board members wanting to make some comments. There are some questions. Helen was very clear in wanting some comments on the possible future initiatives or any other possible areas of coordination alongside those who were mentioned in the presentation. Mark, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Helen, for your presentation. A load of really good food for thought there. Vanya sort of jumped in with trust, and Gabriella mentioned the importance of the public interest. And I think the sort of third leg for me to that, particularly in respect of your comments around safeguarding a resilient and valued profession, is social mobility. And I think that there is an enormously positive story to bring out about the profession and what it can do to support social mobility. Not just on a jurisdictional level, but on an international level, and certainly very happy to have a conversation offline about, ways in which that message could be developed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Laurie.
Thank you. Helen, thank you. That was incredibly interesting and inspirational, as other people mentioned. A couple of comments. One thing I think, and the public interest issue here is huge. We recently did some task force roundtables. That is a tongue twister. And one of the things that became clear to me is the confusion. And I think several of the other people that ran some of the breakouts also noticed this, the confusion among people about what the public interest means. So I think, and it just came out, and I think it's worth all of us as board members reflecting in that space. It's critically important, both in terms of building trust, but also in providing some clarity to people, because some people were saying things like, oh, just compliance with the law, that's enough for the public interest. Of course, there's much more involved there in terms of what practitioners should be thinking about. So I thought that was important. This concept of discussion with people while they're still in university and in that part of the education is very critically important, because we need people starting this profession understanding the public interest side of this and the ethics side of this. I think there's long been criticism at the university level that ethics doesn't play a strong enough role in the educational system in that space. And so these initiatives are fantastic. And then the last thing I would say is, when I looked at the pillars of what you were looking at as your primary educational pillars going forward, I don't see ethics and the IESBA code as a separate standalone element. I think it's part of every single one of those, right? And I think that's really important to stress, and how we attach that and describe that. So just a few thoughts there, but I think great work. And I specifically actually love the Global Ethics Day concept. I think that's something that is really good, because it's sustainable year on year as well. Okay.
Thank you. That whole public interest debate is something that happens at the panel too, especially with ESG. Like, is public interest saving the planet? Is public interest shareholder protection? It's like the stakeholders we're now serving is so different, right? So we have that debate a lot, and the diversity on the panel, it puts us quite squarely in two different camps, but it's an interesting conversation.
And it's very interesting to have this space and this opportunity to debate these topics and these issues. Thank you, Laurie, for your comments. And I really agree that this has to be an integrated action between education, ethics, embedded at all the dimensions, and compliance, which is a different thing. If ethics would be about complying with the law, we would not be necessary. Only the faculties of law would be enough to do the job. But we still have some more comments. Brian, please.
Thanks. So Helen, thanks for a great presentation. And I really wanted to give out some public kudos for the panel's work and the interaction that you've had with the technology working group. And in particular, I'm going to call out two of your members, because I think that they did fantastic review work. So when you're talking about leveraging the work of volunteers, is like we were also the benefactors of that. And so, you know, Greg Owens and Irene Wycheck are fantastic just in terms of the amount of effort that they put in terms of providing us with really technical, detailed feedback and so on some of the work that we did. So thank you very much for that. And also the outreach that we recently held, which was also really great. In terms of some additional items for collaboration, so you've got a couple of them already on the list, some of the kind of bigger picture projects where it's not just code changes that push the envelope in technology and in sustainability. It is the educational parts as well of really changing the mindset of people so that it doesn't have to come down to the letter of the code, but rather they're already oriented toward understanding what the right ethical behaviors are and what the public expectations are and what the profession expects of them as well. The one that I would add to that, and I'm maybe adding to Jens's work in the tax planning area, but tax planning and what we're seeing there as that group moves forward, that will also really benefit from an educational component around mindset and what the expectations are for, you know, aggressive, assertive, however we want to phrase that, tax planning and not doing that, I guess. So thanks.
No more comments? Thank you very much for the suggestion, Brian. Ellen, any other comment?
No, again, thank you for the opportunity and for listening. I appreciate the comments about me being inspiring, and I'm an idealist. I'll tell you, I think I've got 32 items on my work plan. I'm not sure I'll ever get to them all. I might touch all of them, but we'll get some of them done and we'll have an impact. That's the goal. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Helen. And we need idealist people. So thank you very much for joining us and for helping us in spreading our work and leverage on it and preparing the grounds for it as well. Thank you very much for the collaboration. Sima, Mark, I assume that you forgot your budget. Thank you very much. And with this, Ken, unless you have anything else, I think that we are ready for today. Thank you for these very substantial discussions around so different topics, but with something that brings them all together, which is our common interest to work for the public interest and to create trust and etc. So thank you for your commitment and for your participation, and I wish you all good afternoon. So for some of you with some meetings, for others, if possible, to have some rest. And we will reconvene tomorrow at 8:30 as well. At 8:30 with the tax planning discussion to start the day. And we have a dinner tonight. Right?
Indeed, there is a social activity for the board. That's a dinner. And just a reminder for those who are going to the dinner, if you haven't already done so, to please contribute or send your contributions as Ju's way. She's at the back. Thank you.
Thank you. See you later.
Thank you.